good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the MLK Day Symposium afternoon session. I might also remind everyone that after this session at 5 o'clock, we'll be doing a Luminary event. Now, you might ask, what is a Luminary? Well, our friends and neighbors in South Orange and Maplewood, who coordinate the Community Coalition on Race, for the last several years have asked all neighbors in the two communities to take a paper bag and write a message of peace on it to honor Dr. King, and then place some type of luminary, either a live candle or a battery-driven candle light, and place it at your driveway or walkway so that it shows the whole community that we are lighting a little light. And the more little lights we have, we overcome the darkness. That's actually a paraphrase off of a quote from Dr. King. He said, "I'll never let hate cause me to hate, but what the world needs is a little bit more light." And that comes out of scripture also, out of the book of John. So we're so pleased and proud to have you with us this afternoon. Now we'll be probing more deeply using the scholars from the university to look at various aspects of how the nature of life in America, unfortunately, while our Constitution talks about everyone being free and equal under the law, we find that actually there's a residual of unfairness which has permeated the fabric of the nation. And these scholars will be looking at how that occurs from our theological foundations, our historical chapters of life, the educational realm, the social construction of our identities. You heard me correct, social construction of who we are. There's a socially constructed Negro. There is a social construction around the idea of whiteness. You might even say there's a social construction around being American. If you think about the events that occurred in Washington, D.C. just about 1 week ago, we see how some people have a social construction around patriotism. They think it's within their view as patriots just to storm the Capitol and do what they wanted to do. Anyway, that's a matter of further analysis. But we are gathered this afternoon to probe more deeply the nature of racism and how it permeates everything in life, from influences classism, racism, colorism, sexism, etc. And we are so proud to have you with us this afternoon as I begin this session. I'm going to be taking a look at, as I hopefully can share my screen properly, and I need Bert to just guide me to make sure that what I'm seeing is what everyone else is going to be seeing. What do you got, Bert?
I got a Word document, sir, and it looks great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Can everybody see it? You think the size of it's okay?
Yeah, I think you're fine.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It takes teamwork to make the dream work. If Dr. King were here today, he'd probably say that. Okay, here we go. So what I'm going to be doing, everyone, and particularly for the students involved who are enrolled in the MLK Day Symposium, I'm going to be taking in about a look at 9 areas of analysis that Dr. King has already applied his thoughts to. And feel free, you should all of you take down all of these quotes as best you can, but let's look at the meaning of it together as we walk through this. And let's take a look at the areas first of all. We're looking at Dr. King speaking on leadership, the roots of oppression, on the new racism that we see all around us, the nature of privilege, the nature of rhetoric, labeling, and so forth, civic engagement, looking at our workplaces, looking at building a diversity toolkit, and ultimately, let's look at our souls. So here we go. On the area of leadership, yes, I know. King has said to us that everybody can be great, because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You only need a heart of grace and a soul generated by love. So let's take a look briefly at a heart of grace. Grace can be defined as it comes out of the scriptures, as the unmerited grace, which means sometimes you've done something wrong, but everybody who knows you did something wrong is not going to hold it against you. They will be filled with forgiveness. Just think about that for a minute. Let's look at the concept of soul. The scriptures remind us, for example, for what should it profit any man that you gain the whole world and its material goods, but you lose your soul in the process? So, what does that mean to us? Well, it may mean that while we are alive, we all like to buy toys. When we're little, somebody buys them for us. When we're older, we start to lay out the money ourselves. Imagine spending $800 to $1,000 for a phone, for example. But once we are no longer here in our physical sense, it is our soul that perhaps spends eternity in the afterlife. But for what should it matter that in life you've gotten all the toys you wanted, but you lose your soul in the process? I've often commented that if I ever had a chance to speak at the White House during the term of the 45th President of the United States, who only has a few more hours left in office, that this would be the sermon I would preach. The soul matters. Let's look now at the next quote on oppression. And when we look at oppression, we must understand that it's not just about color. There can be oppression in the country around the areas of religion, around race, sex, our native population, around classes, upper, middle, lower, working class, poor. Dr. King once said, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers' profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, then the triple giants of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Think about that. On the issue of racism, whether it's classical racism, modern racism, or the new racism, involving microaggressions. Someone has written a text on how come, racism without having racists? How is that possible? But there's some people who would swear up and down that they're not racist, except the outcome of their impact of their behaviors on others bring about racist outcomes. Hate groups, corporate policy. Notice how ever since the killing of George Floyd, there's been a residual wave of humanism sweeping over America, even corporate policies. Companies now making outward statements on how immoral racism actually is and racial brutalization. Look at how the NFL has taken a complete 180-degree turn from the stance they took with Colin Kaepernick to the present moment. Dr. King says, there is some good in the worst of us, and there's some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. In the scriptures, we read that not one of us is without sin. So how dare we cast an ill light upon our brothers and sisters? On the issue of privilege, every man must decide whether he will walk in the light of creative altruism, which means in helping others, or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. It's mine, give it to me. You can't have it. Sounds like lessons we'd be teaching to a child. On the issue of rhetoric and how we communicate and how we label other people, I raised the philosophical question, do all lives matter? If so, why is it that we only see Black folks being shot down in public and choked down, losing the breath of life which only God can give us? Dr. King comments, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. Think about that. When's the last time you sat down with someone that you might have had those thoughts about that you didn't know too well, that you saw no reason to even talk with them because you're not acquainted? How much overgeneralization is going on in that lack of relationship? Let us all commit ourselves as we go forward from today to bring ourselves into community relationships with one another. In the area of civic engagement, confrontation and resolution, which is really asking us implicitly, what can we do in our campuses, in our families, in our schools, our communities? What can we do? Dr. King says it all in this one poignant statement that the whole globe is now reciting. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We all must learn how to be attuned to what those injustices are. Right now, if you lived on an Indian reservation in the western portions of this nation, perhaps it's an oil pipeline that is coming through your property that you are very concerned about, but it seems like maybe the rest of the country is not. So you need to bring it to everyone's attention so that the local injustice can be seen as a national problem. Or perhaps you live in Michigan, where water is the issue. And indeed, local activists saw to it that that issue became brought to the national attention. And now even the former governor is being held to task legally for failing to do his job totally for all citizens. As we look at the workplace, which brings up everything from legal considerations to workplace access and personal considerations. You must understand that intelligence plus character is the true goal of education. That each of us must roll up our sleeves at the workplace to see to it that indeed it is an equitable place for each and every one of us, no matter what you look like, what your religion is, what your sexual orientation is, and so forth. So once again, intelligence is not just a matter of getting a college degree. It's a matter of the character and the values, the attitudes you build along the way. And I would hope that as we move to our next area, the diversity toolkit, this is not just a box that you would carry around. It's in a sense a virtual collection of all of your values, your attitudes, the techniques you have acquired. In Dr. King's book, A Testament of Hope, we read the following, that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And finally, we must all come to see that at the end, we seek a society that is at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. We think about America at this moment in the 21st century, and I can think of no better quote that summarizes the essence of the environment around us at this point in time. under the administration of the 46th POTUS of the United States, Biden and Harris, peace among all of us will have to become a major agenda item. And I would hope that many of us at the university can spend some time in our classrooms and in collective exchange, looking at how we can learn to become the distributors and the activists who help to bring America to a higher level of peace. I would hope and pray that part of the outcome and residuals from this MLK Day Symposium in the year 2021 will help bring us all closer to being empowered to all move forward to becoming ambassadors of peace. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Charles Carter from our Seton Hall Department of Religious Studies. He will be followed in order by additional faculty from the university. We thank you very much for your time and attention. Dr. Carter, the platform is yours.
There we go. Now I'm going to request control so I can see if I can add my okay. First of all, can people hear me?
Yes, they can.
Okay. And now I want to get that really nice PowerPoint I've been working my tail off trying to put together, but I don't see my
I think, Forrest, you'll have to release your remove yourself as presenter, and then whoever's up there now, I think that's Forrest.
I did. My request was not accepted. All right, now let me
Dr.
just
Carter,
see if,
try it now, please. Try and share your PowerPoint now. It should work.
all right.
There we go.
Hold on a minute. I'm not sure if you can see it yet or not. I don't think you can.
Not yet, sir.
Okay, let me get back to my, I'm on Teams. See, I made the mistake. I decided I wanted to work on my iMac, and I've been presenting all semester on my my laptop, and I see the in Teams on my Mac that allows me to share my screen. So I don't want to take up too much time on this. If I can't figure this out in a second, I'm going to just start talking, and you'll get the proverbial talking head.
But I might also add, if my voice is coming over, we could probably make that available, perhaps with some technical expertise, with the recording later, or make it available.
Yeah.
To students. So go right ahead, Chuck, and just.
I'm going to go ahead. Before I begin, what were my prepared remarks? I'm going to, and you can imagine this as a nice set of text going across your screen. I'm quoting two observations from Dr. Cornel West in his introduction to his book, The Radical King. Came out in 2015. It's a collection of Dr. King's writings that he edited. And in this, in the introductory material, either of the entire book or of specific sections of the book, he reminds us that King's mission has often been muted by portraits of him as the great spiritual, political, and moral leader who opposed, and Forrest, you talked about this, the scourge of racism, militarism, materialism, and he often added into the materialism poverty. He said, these are the things that we have to face as a country. And so here are two quotes from Cornel West about Dr. King. For King, the struggle against the legacy of white supremacy was never a strategic move or tactical afterthought. Rather, it was a profound existential and moral matter of great urgency. King knew that white supremacy in various forms was a global phenomenon. It remains shot through our hearts and minds, institutions and structures, smartphones and unwise politicians. The modes of racist domination, from barbaric slavery to bestial Jim Crow Sr. to cruel Jim Crow Jr., are never reducible to individual prejudice or personal bias. Empire, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and homophobia are linked in complex ways, and our struggle against them requires moral consistency and systemic analysis, says West about Dr. King. And then in another section of his book, he introduces a speech that Dr. King gave about Dr. Nelson Mandela. King and Mandela, he says, are two towering public figures in the past 50 years in the world. Both have been Santa Clausified, tamed, domesticated, sanitized, and sterilized into non-threatening and smiling old men with toys in their bags and forgiveness in their hearts. Yet both were radical and revolutionary. They were hunted, hated, and hurt by the powers that be, and both had radical love. And that was my opening PowerPoint. I'll make that available at some point in time. So now to my real remarks about the Bible and racism. Oh, the Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the word of God, the Bible. Hey! We learned that in Vacation Bible School, all about the Bible. I and lots of Protestant little kids across the country learned that. I don't know if they still do. I don't go to Vacation Bible School anymore. Harmless enough, right? Who can find fault with talking and singing about how great the Bible is? Now, the Bible is a wonderful book in many ways, but not in all ways. And I've spent my life teaching it, oftentimes preaching it. Sometimes I feel like a preacher without a congregation. My students will vouch for that. It's a book that I love, but it's a book that I find troubling. When I start my intro to Bible classes, I tell my students that we're going to look at the Bible, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a lot that's good. There's a lot that we can celebrate. There's a lot that Dr. King spoke about. These are stories of oppressed people being freed. Calls for what my colleagues David Carr, who teaches at Union Seminary, and our own Professor Colleen Conway they translate this word from Hebrew that is often translated righteousness. They translate it as social solidarity. That's so much better and down to earth than the concept of what's right and good. That's a nice concept. But for them, they say the Hebrew prophets are talking about being down there in the trenches with the people. Jesus critiques the poor, the rich. The Gospel of Luke is a scathing critique of privilege and power, religious and social. God is love. That is the ultimate summation of the Gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. So whether it's a critique of Babylon or Rome, the Bible is crafted in an atmosphere of oppression and resistance. Resistance against empire and resistance against imperialism, ancient and modern. And I would say today, especially, it is a book against American imperialism. Here I have my slide of the Christian flag being flown by these people that call themselves patriots, but I would call Christian insurrectionists. They know nothing of Jesus of Nazareth, at least as I know him. Unfortunately, today my task is not to talk about the good things about the Bible. Maybe next year, if Dr. King, I just called Dr. Pritchett Dr. King, if Dr. Pritchett will invite me back, I can talk about some of the good parts of Scripture. But today, I feel that those are the things that we celebrate so often, especially when we talk about Dr. King, but we do not want to talk about the bad things. It's like this little Longfellow poem about the girl with the curl. When she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. And some parts of the Bible, as they have been taught and used by the church, particularly the white church, are horrid. They are problematic, racist, chauvinist, sexist, homophobic, militaristic, imperialist, and patriarchal at worst. And I'm talking about the worst. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It's not pleasant. I know that. It's not the message I would like to give. But because it is so often neglected, I feel it is incumbent upon me. And I'm not just a teacher of Scripture, but I am also an ordained clergy person. I do not often use that hat. I don't wear that coat. But today I did, because I take of utmost seriousness the good, the bad, and the ugly in Scripture. So we're going to look at a few passages that have been used to support racist ideas and racist ideologies, including but not exclusive to the international slave trade, the American system of slave ownership, Jim Crow, voter suppression, the carceral state, and the notion popularized in some white right-wing evangelical circles. These are moderate evangelical circles, that the Black Lives Matter movement and the call for social justice is a deviation from the Christ. We're talking not just about things that used to be believed, used to be practiced, used to be taught. Instead, they are very real expressions of American and often American Christian white supremacy. Now, the quick version, and I've probably taken almost all of my time just getting going. In white supremacist circles, some white evangelical circles, this is more fringe. Adam was created as a white man. That's not in the Bible, but that is the way that some people interpret it. The curse of Cain, when Cain kills Abel, Yahweh curses him as he exiles him. Some people have said, interpreted, that the curse of Cain is blackness. A passage in Genesis chapter 9, after Noah is done, he comes off from the ark. And he comes off from the ark, and he becomes the first vintner. And evidently Noah liked his drink a fair bit, maybe a little too much. And in this story in Genesis, Noah gets drunk and he passes out. This isn't the story you got told in Sunday school, I'm pretty sure. Noah passes out and he's laying naked in a drunken stupor, and one of his sons sees him and he looks at him and he says, "Oh man, he goes to his brothers, take a look at this, guys. Dad is passed out drunk and he's bare naked." And his brothers take a garment and they walk backwards and they cover him, and Noah wakes up from his drunken sleep and he realizes what has happened, and he curses not Ham, his son, but Canaan, his grandson. Now, many people in the history of this country and in Europe interpreted that as the curse of the black race. The Hamitic peoples are North Africa, as far as Libya, down into Ethiopia, Sudan, all of Africa. Now, in Scripture, it's not Ham that is cursed, it is Canaan that is cursed. Why? Because the Israelites want to make sure that this passage won't give credence to their occupation of Palestine. Second set of passages has to do with slave ownership. In the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, slave ownership is allowed. Nobody thinks anything about it. In the biblical traditions, in Exodus, the first law in Exodus is about how to set people free from enslavement. But slave owners looked at that passage and said, well, this means that the Bible supports slavery. So therefore, we can also be slave owners. In the New Testament, in the letters attributed to Paul, Paul says he's quoting an ancient Roman code. And in that Roman code, the father, the patriarch, is the head. And everybody else is subject to the law and rule of the father. Slaves, obey your master in all things. Therefore, when Americans owned slaves, they believed that it was their right to do so, and they believed that their slaves owed them a debt of obedience. A final thing is a lengthy passage in the book of Romans. And in the book of Romans, Paul says in chapter 13 to all of the people at the church at Rome, but of course that became normative for all Christians in all times, obey the government because God gave you the government. God put all governments in place, therefore it is the responsibility of Christians to obey their governments. And so Christians have used that passage, some quite as a matter of belief, even though their government was doing things they didn't think was good and right, they felt that it was God's expectation of them to be supportive of whatever the government wanted to do. These are all things that led to the what I'm going to call the original cancel culture. There's a lot of talk on the right now about cancel culture. You want to get rid of Confederate statues. You want to do away with certain things that you learned in your history. Well, that's cancel culture. No, the original cancel culture is the Europeans coming over and exterminating the indigenous people. The original cancel culture is white Americans holding slaves. Okay, so another thought that I have that relates to this in terms of the way in which the Bible was used to terrorize people. And here you have to imagine the two side-by-side photographs that I have of James Cone wrote a very important book called The Church. And what he said in that book was that for so many Christians, the church is the cross is the place of liberation. But for so many in the Black community, the church, excuse me for that Freudian slip, the cross was a reminder of the lynching tree. And anytime anybody was lynched, it was like the place for the white church was a place of terror for the Black church. And one of the things that Cone says in that book, and I had a couple of examples of this, was that there were postcards that were taken of lynchings. And we have examples of them with, messages on the front and on the back of these postcards Lynching was a cultural event. And sometimes it was mentioned in, according to Cone, the church bulletin. And then after church, come over here to the picnic and we're going to lynch somebody. This is a part of the legacy of the Bible and racism. How am I doing for time?
I'm coming. I'm about ready to ask you one summary question as soon as you finished. But your
Well,
time
then,
is.
I've gone over, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So okay, I'm done.
All right, but Chuck, what I'd like to ask
What
you.
I want to, I do want to. Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. But what I would just want to ask is one question for all of us. In light of the history that you have pointed out within the scripture and so forth, but what should we all do moving forward? And just a concise answer might be, if you would have one. But is there a special role for the faith community, for church leaders? By church, I mean national church leaders. I can think about the appointment of the first African American cardinal, Gregory, for example, and I'm assuming he'll be taking a very, very progressive stance on the American Catholic community at this point relative to race relations. But in that context, do you have a quick response to what other faith leaders might be doing?
I think here I want to follow the suggestion of Jim Wallace, who is a white leader in the progressive evangelicals. I don't think many evangelicals like him that much, but that's another matter. First thing he says is we have to recognize white privilege for what it is. So I'm talking about the white church. The white church needs to recognize white privilege. Southern Baptists wanted to change that. They said, we don't like white privilege. We like to talk about white blessing. Well, let's deal with the realities. Let's deal with sin. Let's call racism sin, and let's say we need to repent from sin, and we need to move toward establishing justice in everything that we do. So if I were asked, what is the positive role of the Bible, I would have given a much more edifying passage, 15 minutes. And it would have been always to stand on the side of the oppressor, always to stand against the oppressor. That I believe every person, whatever your background, but especially being so easy on themselves.
Okay. I'm going to thank Dr. Carter as he's going to set the Olympic record for being frozen in space. But Chuck, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And I'm quite sure that if other students are directing questions to me over the next, I'll be sure to direct them towards you as I shepherd them and steward them through the rest of the semester. It is now my pleasure to move to our Department of History, where one of the longest tenured faculty members there has joined us this afternoon. We thank him for his time. You know, life is not as simple as it appears by just looking at screens, but we all are dealing with the multiplicity of just how to survive during this COVID period, and we appreciate, despite any health struggles that Dr. Green is dealing with, his presence this afternoon. I'm now going to turn the screen over to Dr. Larry Green, who will be looking at racism in history. Thank you, Dr. Green. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Everyone see me okay? Okay, I'm not sure. Sometimes if I switch over to my next table over here, it's a better photo. Okay, I'm going to try and I think remember how to share this. Do I request control? Is Burke there?
Burke will
No,
give you
sir.
all.
Okay, just please just hold on one moment. This is important.
Anyway,
Hello?
while Dr. Green is gone, I'm quite sure that any of you who might have questions, we might ask that you could keep, if you have a brief question, please, just one sentence. You may put it into the spot for Q&A, and I will be monitoring that through our technical assistants. Thank you. Dr. Green has returned.
Yeah, that was my cardiologist's office for clearance for the surgery tomorrow, so that's why I had to take that.
So you are
Okay.
still alive, right? You are alive. That's what he was telling you. You are alive.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad.
Okay. Let's see how do I do this. Do I request control or I think.
What you'll do is there'll be a little square with an arrow in it.
Yeah.
If you click on that, that's how you'll share whatever PowerPoint you would like to show.
Okay. Let's see. I clicked on it. I didn't see the X come up yet. Let's see.
Do you see your PowerPoint?
Yes. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet,
You have
sir.
to click on it, and Burke will walk you through it, but
Can you see it?
not yet.
Not yet, sir.
Okay, let's go back to Teams. I'm going to click again on the arrow. And now let's see. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
Maybe it's coming in.
There you
Oh.
go.
There it is.
You'll only need to launch it into presentation mode, and then we'll be good.
Okay, here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, this is Racism in History, a brief historical analysis, snapshots in time. So I'm trying to do in 15 minutes. So I guess I have to about 20 to 2. I'm trying to do what I do in, in a year. So this is obviously not comprehensive. So let's take a look at this. This is the middle passage, and I don't know why that came up first. Let me see. Okay, it's a little out of order, but I'm going to go back to this. This is a, get this rid of this down here. This is a drawing, a sketch of a slaver or a slave ship called the Brooks. It's a very famous drawing. And what this indicates, as you can see, people are prone. They are laying down on the ship. They are chained beneath the decks. And in some cases, the space between the decks was about 5.5 feet. Some slavers felt that the more you packed in, these were the people called the tight packers, then the more they could sell when they reached the New World, even though there would be a higher mortality rate because of infectious disease and tight packing. They felt that it would be more to be sold. So the calculation had to do purely with money and wealth. From time to time, they would bring slaves up on deck to combat what was called fixed melancholy. Fixed melancholy was an 18th century word for depression. And in some cases, those that were enslaved on these ships, taken from their homeland, they jumped overboard. So I want you to know that the transatlantic slave trade, which brought approximately 11 million people to the New World, had a 20% mortality rate. So in other words, we're looking at about 2 million bodies in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico. This does not count how many people died in the slave-holding fortresses, such as Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle or Goree Island on the West African coast. You could actually visit those today, and tourists are taken on those. So I'm going to go to the next one. This is a drawing of those slaves that are brought up on deck. The feeling was that sunlight and air would relieve depression. Actually, it didn't. Some took the opportunity, if they could, if their shackles were loosened, to jump overboard. So the transatlantic slave trade, of course, the first step in the enslavement process, was a terrible, unchristian and inhumane affair. But it was, as Professor Carter pointed out, a very Christian affair. Some of the slave ships were often blessed. So how was this very inhuman practice, which lasted 400 years, from the 1600s into the 1800s, almost 300 years. How was it rationalized? Well, one way was to dehumanize African societies as the very antithesis of civilization. So there was a lot of works passed talking about how barbaric West Africans were, or that they were cannibals, that they were related to apes and baboons and monkeys, that they even had sexual relations with those. These were a part of some of the English writings that Winthrop Jordan, in his book, White Over Black, Anglo-American Attitudes Toward the Negro, 1550 to 1812, goes through English literature in this part, including works by Edward Topsell and Henry VII and others that repeat these stereotypes. The other aspect was to deny any Black contributions to society. So if we're talking about Timbuktu and other African cities, and even noting that Egypt was a mixed race civilization, particularly if we talk about the time when the kingdom in the Sudan was in control of Pharaonic Egypt. So all of this is dismissed. Africans were heathens, barbarians. This is very, very important to rationalizing the slave trade and slavery itself. By the time we get to the 1700s, this belief was so common. Thomas Jefferson, in Notes on the State of Virginia, said that Blacks were morally and intellectually inferior. So this is very key point here. And perhaps this is how the president had his ideas about African countries all being shithole societies, as he said, quote unquote. I'm going to skip over that last point, the next to last point, because I mentioned that already. What I want to talk about next is the last bullet point, and that is this view of Africa and African people, and that includes those throughout the diaspora, as barbaric and inferior, is picked up by American historians of the slave South. One of the important people in this view was Aldrich B. Phillips, who was a Georgia descendant of a Southern slave owner. But Phillips taught for many years at Yale, and by the turn of the century, he was considered one of the leading authorities in the country, at the turn of the century, 1900, and he held a chair at Yale University. He influenced textbooks all across the country, and his view, it's called by historians the Phillips School, influenced school boards in writing about African American history and African American enslavement, I should say, well into the 1950s, which is when the revisionist school arose. And you can see this in Phillips calling slavery a school for civilizing. He did this in American Negro Slavery and in his other work, Life and Labor in the Old South. But he wrote many works before that. So this is how many of our textbooks developed this benign view of slavery, which was very critical to the Southern myth of the lost cause, which I wanted to talk about. The myth of the lost cause, which began after the Civil War, in which the South lost the Civil War, but they may have won the propaganda battle, because there was this notion of nobility on both sides. The South fighting for states' rights and their principles, and the North fighting for their view of the Constitution. But the myth of the nobility of the Confederate cause is based upon the myth of slavery as a benign institution, which it wasn't. It was maintained by force, and brutality was used to control the enslaved population. And when we look at this notion about the Confederate monuments and the Confederate battle flags, and making this cause noble, then let's talk about what it really was. In Alexander Stephens, in the spring of 1861, when secession was at its height, and he had been chosen as the vice president of the Confederacy, made a famous speech called the Cornerstone Speech. And in it, it's very clear. It is about white supremacy. This is what the Confederacy is about, which is not what Stephens said a few years later after the war, when he makes noble this idea of states' rights, and slavery wasn't a part of it. But what did he say at the beginning of the Confederate States of America? He stated in this speech that the new government of the Confederacy is dedicated to the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And in this speech, he also excoriates some of the founding fathers who had doubts about slavery and thought that it might pass away. This is very interesting. To this end, the Confederacy waged a war, based on most recent statistics, that took 750,000 American lives, 750,000 lives. And more lives lost than all American wars combined. And at the end of the Civil War, waged a covert war to subvert the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The more recent figures on Black lives lost during Reconstruction, when the Ku Klux Klan and other white paramilitary outfits waged war to control Black labor in this post-Civil War period. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, 14th Amendment was the made Black citizens, 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. That took over 3,000 African American lives during Reconstruction. 34 Black elected and appointed officials during Reconstruction assassinated. 100 Black elected and appointed officials attacked. So the notion that what you see in the Capitol today is not an outlier. It's not an anomaly. It is a part of the American tradition. This is the duality of the American tradition about profession, about rights and equality, and also the reality of this major subtext of inequality and racism. The second Ku Klux Klan was revived in 1915. In addition to being anti-Black, it rose to 3 million members on the basis of hostility to Blacks, immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. Many of its members served at local levels, state levels, and even one former Klansman on the Supreme Court. This is Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy. This is a lynching, and that is a woman that is lynched, and a man. Lynching was common in the period from the early 1890s through the 1930s. Approximately 3,000 Black people were lynched. Most in public spectacles, as Professor Carter has mentioned, with postcards. You could go on the Without Sanctuary website or look at the order the book of photographs of lynchings and postcards that was at this exhibit that was at the New York Historical Society. It is very comprehensive and very disturbing. This is the second Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, lining up. The sign, which might not be so clear, is this is the Bucks County, Pennsylvania Ku Klux Klan. This is probably from the early 20s. The Klan was no longer simply a Southern organization, the second Ku Klux Klan. It was now what? A national organization with chapters all throughout the Northeast, the Midwest. New Jersey had a chapter of the Klan, and Indiana had a very large Klan. It was all over the Midwest. It was not only a Southern organization. The third major reincarnation of the Ku Klux Klan follows the Brown decision in '54, Montgomery bus boycott in '55, decentralization of Central High School in Little Rock, and so on. In other words, the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And this period marks the reemergence of the Confederate battle flag into the state flags of many Southern states, because it accompanied the motto and the declaration of Southern governors that there would be massive resistance to integration. The Klan and other organizations responsible for many attacks on Black churches and civil rights workers occurred in this particular period. Some 200 Black churches were attacked during the entire period of the modern civil rights movement. Since Barack Obama's election, there has been a significant increase in racial hate crimes in organizations. As B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center have tracked. What lessons can we learn? Progress and backlash against the beginning dismantling of the American caste system. Whenever there is progress on the part of African Americans, however limited, there seems to be an automatic backlash. Some of this is, of course, and virtually all of it is instigated by racist beliefs, but it's also instigated to, or increased, or intensified by the economic anxiety and decline in status of those attracted to hate groups, even if those who they hate are not responsible for their decline in status. The scapegoating of racial and religious minorities and women is quite common today. But what we must remember is that we must hold to the best in our traditions, not the worst. There can be no compromise with haters. Albert Einstein, who fled anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, said of American racism as he observed it once he arrived here. He observed racism against blacks. And he wrote, "The more I feel an American, the more this situation pains me. I can escape the feelings of complicity in it only by speaking out against it." As Congressman, not Josh Lewis, I mean John Lewis, said, when you see something wrong, say something, do something. And this is what we must do if we are to make progress against this historic and lingering pattern of racism in America. Okay, that's it. I think I've come in under time. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Everyone can hear you, Larry. Thank you very much.
So if there are any questions,
Well, I'd like to ask just a practical question on behalf of everyone. How you, in this last slide, you indicate those lessons and patterns, but how can our, say, current day students, how can they make use of this information?
I think the information should motivate them to continue in a spirit of activism that Dr. King talked about in opposing this racism. I think involvement in the political arena, social justice, fighting against inequality, whether it's health inequality, inequality in law enforcement, and of course, getting involved in the political structure. The political life of the country is very, very important to ensure the movement toward equality, because those folks that do not want to see equality and of condition or opportunity are involved in the political life. So we have to be, and students have to be involved in that. And at the grassroots level is a great beginning, on the local level as well, in your communities. You know, what is being taught in your schools?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to add something just in terms of how I would also carry that message to students, particularly since we have a criminal justice major. But one of the challenges for those who may be going into police work is not just for them to qualify to become a police officer, but once they're on the inside and they now begin to see what is invisible to many of us from the outside, which is referred to as the blue wall of silence, which simply means there's a kind of a code, a sense of values from the inside of the police departments that police officers do not talk about other police officers, do not hold them accountable. And so that if they were to hone up their leadership skills, that's exactly what they would need to do. So Dr. Green, I want to thank you very much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you.
For participation. We wish you well in all of your matters of health for you and your family. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We will now turn our attention to the area of health and delivery of healthcare services. Due to reasons of health, we have asked Dr. Kirk Johnson, beyond his current status, if he could share with us. Dr. Johnson is affiliated with our Department of Religious Studies. He holds a Doctor of Medical Humanities degree from Drew University. So he looks at the intersections of race, class, and our values and attitudes toward healthcare, the healthcare systems, and how those healthcare systems relate their services or do not relate their services to various populations. So if our technical team is ready, we will now be blessed by this innovative analysis coming from Dr. Kirk Johnson. Thank you so much.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize I can't be there virtually live, but I wanted to be a part of this awesome MLK Symposium that we host every year. And my particular presentation is going to be on social determinants of health, specifically within the realm of medical school. So how doctors actually could be advocates for equity in communities of color. And of course, this is even more relevant today with, of course, the pandemic and COVID-19 and communities of color being hit harder compared to other communities. So I'm going to be talking about implementing racial equity training in medical school curriculum. Some objectives would be, of course, number one, provide an overview of the usage of race equity in the United States medical schools curriculum, suggestions toward racial equity implementation in medical education, and a brief pedagogical and practical solutions for current and future doctors that they could use to strengthen racial equity and interpersonal skills for better clinical outcomes. So according to the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, critical race theory is a framework that offers researchers, practitioners, and policymakers a race-conscious approach to understanding educational inequality and structural racism to find solutions that lead to greater justice. In the medical lens, critical race theory has a connection to health disparities. In a 2017 survey, which is right in front of you for your visual pleasure, 92% of United States family medicine department chairs reported their medical school curriculum included aspects of racial and ethnic disparities. Many department chairs were not satisfied with course quality and content in their programs. There was not any quantitative and qualitative measurement to accurately measure the quality and effectiveness of curricula. With this being said, similar surveys suggest a disconnect about physicians' knowledge about race, human genetics, epigenetics, and the causes of health disparities. Health disparities are important to incorporate in curricula, but such inquiry only focuses on the symptom of the problem, but not really the source of the problem. What needs to be examined is the concept of race itself and how it has shaped our social institutions, social systems, which leads to the consequence of health disparities. This is a work of racial equity in medical education. Studies have shown that there is nothing in the medical curriculum like the critical race theory that has flourished in legal studies since the late 1980s, when some law schools with more elective time and a long tradition of incorporating critical social theory and history into coursework began integrating critical race theory into their curricula, solidifying the importance of humanities and social science. The United States Medical Licensing Exam and the Medical College Admission Test, otherwise known as the MCATs for those undergrads who are trying to get into medical school. The MCAT integrated sections in the national exams. Specifically, they integrated sections in medical humanities, which shows that medical humanities complements racial pedagogy in medical school curricula. Medical school faculty, unfortunately, do not have the competency to adequately teach critical race theory because, of course, it's not part of their training and education. A medical humanities program, which of course we have at Seton Hall, we have a minor in medical humanities specifically, and also a medical humanities student undergraduate group specifically. But a medical humanities program gives medical schools the opportunity to hire scholars that specialize in complexities of race and medicine. Also, medical humanities introduces faculty and students to other areas of complement critical race theory, like history of medicine, medical anthropology, research ethics, bioethics, medical narrative, palliative care, and other medical humanities-based courses. In addition, medical humanities is a tool for the medical schools to reconsider its pedagogy and usage of race, which is not a biological reality, since of course we know this since the 1950s, but a social and political construction. An example of the race as myth, or those individuals that actually created this social construction, of race are American influences of self-identification that came from Carl von Linnaeus, individual to your right, and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, individual to your left. Swedish botanist Carl von Linnaeus, known as the father of taxonomy, created the classification of skin color in the first modern study of man. German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach included skin color, skull, and physiognomy, or the facial features of man, in 5 categories and coined the term Caucasian from the Caucasus Mountains. So the actual term Caucasian was rooted in literally a geographical mountain range that separates Europe from Asia, and this is called the Caucasus Mountains. So Linnaeus and Blumenbach are important figures in the classification of racial groups. As I mentioned earlier, since 1950, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, the American Sociological Association, and the American Anthropological Association all agree that race is not a proxy for biological explanations in difference. Yet, the concept of race as an explanation for disease is still infiltrating science and medicine, and yes, our society in the 21st century. So let's look at some current studies. In 2016, 2 first-year medical students of color expressed concern regarding their textbook illustrating that normal, quote-unquote, gums are bright and pink. Also, the criteria for a newborn baby's health is its pink appearance. Recent studies in dermatology suggest Black Americans with melanoma, a type of skin cancer, are more than 4 times as likely as white Americans to be diagnosed only after their cancer has already spread to other parts of the body. Half of dermatologists report that their medical schools did not prepare them to diagnose cancer on Black skin. In addition, barely 1 in 10 dermatology residents include a rotation in which physicians in training gain specific experience treating patients with different colors of skin. Such ideas of skin color and the lack of people, or the lack of people of color represented in medical textbooks, assert a form of white academic supremacy, if you will, which is the belief that individuals who are categorized as white are inherently superior and have inherent value compared to people from other racial groups. Such assertions are troubling, obviously, and are consequences of an American medical and racial history that has not been reconciled. And as we've seen the past few years, this is even more clearly evident in our politics, in our government, and in our country. Today, eugenics has been condemned. Ironically, ideas of race that were shaped by eugenic thinking still exist in normal science. Even the use of licensing examinations perpetuate racial stereotypes, albeit unintentionally. Consequently, unwarranted ideas, race is difficult to retract. The same goes for physicians' perceptions of race. Many physicians believe that there are genetic differences between races, which explain racial health disparities. It is apparent that the concept of race is ingrained within our culture and society. Medical education has a responsibility, as well as K-12 and higher education as a whole, to correct the pedagogy, research, and ideologies that asserts race and biology have correlation. This is an immense task, but it is achievable. If medical education and education in general does not deal with perceptions and usage of race directly, health and social inequity will continue to remain. In making racial equity focused pedagogy and continuing education, racial equity workshops are requirements, or should be requirements, that are helpful in developing racial competency and solidarity among physicians. Here we have in front of you a fairly recent August 14, 2019 New York Times article that talks about the myths about physical racial differences were used to justify slavery and are still believed by doctors today. Another particular current study that I'm going to go into shortly, as you see in front of your screen. The caveat about talking about race is vulnerability. It's very uncomfortable, and individuals are hard in trying to find the correct words to say, whether it's white individuals and of course Black individuals as well. And currently there are no models to diffuse tension between specifically doctors discussing race and privilege. White doctors talking about race have a tendency, as I said earlier, of becoming uncomfortable, emotional, and fearful. Feelings of guilt, denial, defensiveness, sadness, and frustration are described as white fragility. And as many of you are aware of Robin DiAngelo's New York Times bestseller book entitled White Fragility, which talks about the social complexities of this particular term and topic. Specifically, white fragility is known as the defensiveness and avoidance that arise for people, specifically white individuals, when facing even a minimum amount of racial distress. An example of white fragility in a medical school setting was in a qualitative study, which again is in front of your screen right here. And this qualitative study was done in 2 United Kingdom medical schools. The results of the study mentioned white students being fearful discussing race-related issues, medical students of color being viewed as different, and barriers talking about race. In addition, such feelings were evaluated by medical resident Catherine C. Brooks. In her article in the Journal of in the Journal of American Medical Association. And this is a very powerful quote, and it reads, "But regardless of intent, the message I got was clear. I've learned to minimize the pain, forego the consent, blame the behaviors, and dismiss the concerns of my patients of color. I've witnessed missed opportunities for healing and the loss of patient trust, and believe that if we refuse to deeply examine and challenge how racism and implicit bias affect our clinical practice, we will continue to contribute to health inequalities in a way that will remain unaddressed in our curriculum and unchallenged by future generations of physicians." And this again, at the time was from now doctor, but at that time, medical resident Catherine C. Brooks. So as you see, these are normal reactions discussing race. Such emotions and feelings need to be expressed, examined, and resolved in a space, culture, and mission that embraces such dialogue without fear of consequences. Pedagogical approaches using emotional intelligence should be incorporated in medical school curricula and also in K through 12 and overall higher education curricula. Deep racial examination in the clinical practice and in higher education in general starts with recognizing one's biases, which of course is self-awareness. Here we have British Medical Journal of August 21st of last year, where they've done a study that Black babies are less likely to die when cared for by Black doctors, US study finds. And this is from one of the premier medical peer-reviewed journals in academia, British Medical Journal, that discovered this, which is very alarming. So what is, prenatal health or perinatal health? This is obviously connected to issues of race for Black mothers and Hispanic mothers as well. So how do we alleviate this gap that the outcomes are a lot worse being treated by white doctors compared to Black doctors? Right? And of course, again, this is a rhetorical question, but something we really need to grapple with. Also, September of last year, we see another article. This is from CNN. Whistleblower alleges high rate of hysterectomies and medical neglect at ICE facilities. So this is also connected to racism and immigration, if you will, and this is connected to medicine and medical practice, that hysterectomies were given, and I'm pretty sure these individuals did not give their consent. They didn't say it's okay to do this, but yet these hysterectomies were performed. So to wrap up, because I obviously mentioned a lot of the different challenges and problems that we face. So let's look at some solutions really quick. So of course, applying bioethical principles. Racial awareness is done by, of course, students, faculty, staff, administrators, applying and articulating the principles of bioethics, which are beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, doing no harm, autonomy, which is, of course, one's freedom, and justice, which is implementing and trying to do equity in non-religious and religious settings, as these are applied to racial problems in medical and healthcare practices. Another thing quickly I want to mention is implementing race talk workshops, which basically is a space where students and faculty in a safe space can actually talk about the complexities of race. And lastly, to look at what type of institutional progress has been made, right? So the Society of Internal Medicine's Health Disparity Task Force, as you see, as well as the American Medical Association Foundation, the Academic Alliance for Internal Medicine, the Association of American Medical Colleges, and the Association of Schools of Public Health, all claim now, in the past about 6 to 7 years, have curricula that deal with health disparities and cultural competent training for doctors. And again, these are particular initiatives that just recently happened. So there really hasn't been any qualitative and quantitative data, at least yet right now, to really see the effectiveness of these particular initiatives. And the other 2 points on, 2 points on the slide also talks about different accreditation councils and agencies and what they're trying to do to implement racial equity training and be more culturally competent in regarding the complexities of race and its connections to medicine. And as I said before, in the last point, these interventions have been established basically the last 6 to 7 years. So in conclusion, I just want to offer that race is a complex topic, and we have our work cut out for us in every particular area of life, in every area in academia, but especially within healthcare and medicine. So let us roll up our sleeves and continue to do work to alleviate bad health outcomes and to create more culturally, racially, emotionally intelligent healthcare professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I think the recent sheltering in from COVID-19 and some subsequent consequences that have been reported to us by health officials have shown all of us how different socioeconomic groups are impacted detrimentally. And but we thank you for the insights provided. We'll now turn our attention to our College of Education and Dr. Edmond Adjupan, who will be coming with us to discuss how the educational institution in society can be used either for advancement and equality for all. Sometimes in a educational system within society that's influenced by capitalism, and there's a differential of resources. Some people will use the institution of education, which is to say private education versus public, as a way of manifesting their social class dominance and their access to mobility. So at this point in time, we're going to have Dr. Adjupan come in with us in his own way. And we're looking forward to the liberation that will be yielded by his presentation. Dr. Adjupan, if you are ready.
I'm ready.
I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me, Reverend Pritchett. And I'm delighted to be here and talk about just some things around education and racism in the honor of Dr. King's legacy. So I want to start off by talking about just where we are as a nation, right? I think over the last decade, and even longer, obviously, but I think specifically over the last decade, we've been a divided nation of sorts, right? And then, there are values on both sides. So some might say Black Lives Matter against Blue Lives Matter, Democrats against Republicans, fair elections versus rigged elections, mask versus no mask. And these things are coupled with ideologies and values that folks across the nation have been following and believe. And really based on this last election and the recent events of our nation, our democracy is at stake, right? And I think it's important for us to recognize the context of all these things and instances that are happening and occurring with our nation, and understand the context, right? So as an educator, and as a teacher educator, and someone who prepares teachers to go out into the field, I often ask myself, given the context and the times in our current event, like, what is the role of education, right? And what are the role of educators? And I think a lot of us, just from understanding that we've all been to school. Everybody has an experience with schooling in some way, shape, or form. But it's important for us to recognize that many systems, if not all systems, systemic systems and structures across our nation are rooted in racism, right? So when we talk about education, what's the role of education? We would expect that teachers and scholars or teachers in particular in K-12 schools and even in higher education settings are having these conversations with their students. Number one, are they having them? Do they know how to have them? And our students and our folks feeling safe to have these open conversations around the challenges, whether it be racial, whether it be around any other biases or isms within our classrooms and spaces, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the history of public schooling and public education, because I think that's very important for where we are to understand the systems and structures of education. So when we talk about the history of public education, like I said a moment ago, education across this nation is one institution that's anchored and rooted in racism, right? So you have Horace Mann, who had this amazing idea in the late 1700s, early 1800s, of wanting to educate young people and the youth of our nation. And the idea of providing a public education, so a free education, that was offered, via tax, where was paid for by local taxes, et cetera, for students, was to ensure, our nation's sustainability, right? So if we can educate our nation, the young people of our nation will be able to be on the cutting edge of different revolutions, techniques, industries, and technology. But when we think about when education was started, late 1700s and 1800s, it's important for us to recognize the context of our nation, right? So still slavery existed. Black folks across the nation did not have access to their own freedom. And at this time, we had immigrants who were starting to migrate from European nations across to the Americas. And during that time, the immigrants who were coming from the European nations were also looked at as an other, right? So the idea and the purpose of public schooling was to improve society, right? And whatever that means, right? Improve society in one way, and particularly as it relates to Horace Mann, a white male who's had a lot of privilege at this time, right? Education was looked at, as a solution to social ills. The idea that many Europeans who are coming from these European nations in countries across come to the Americas for a better life and better opportunities, that they had some social ills, right? They were lower on the social ladder, and we wanted to instill them with American values, right? Whatever that meant, right? But when we think about instilling folks with American values, if I'm going to instill you with the values that I believe in as an American, it means that whatever values that you came to this country with, or that you have that might be cultural, you might have to let go of those in order to adhere to American values. We think about the Industrial Revolution. This is when the schools began. We talk about factory models, when you have schools with just students sitting in rows. You had one teacher to about 50 to 70 students in schools. So we're thinking about how schools started to reflect factories during the mid 1800s. Public schools, they were meant to instill common American values amongst youth, particularly those who are immigrants and children of immigrants. And the idea that school reformers, those who thought about schools and had the idea of schools, they focused on systemizing schools to ensure that all students had one shared experience, right? So Horace Mann quotes that education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the human conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. So the idea was that schooling was supposed to put everyone, regardless of your background, who you are, was supposed to allow kind of an equal footing for everyone within our society. But we recognize that our society is not like that, right? Some folks are offered different privileges and different amenities than others, depending on your racial background, your privilege, your socioeconomic status, etc. And it's important for us to recognize these things and this as we talk about the context of education. So I love talking about or providing this example. So this is a picture, a photo of the Carlisle School. So the Carlisle School was a school that was founded in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this was kind of one of Horace Mann's missions as well. We're thinking about education and schooling in the United States. So the Carlisle School was founded in the late 1800s, during a time when the United States was continuing to, the United States had already expanded westward, and there were a lot of indigenous populations who, they didn't identify as the Americans. They were indigenous populations, but the Americans saw them as a threat, right? So there were a lot of small wars and battles with Native Americans and indigenous populations across the country. And what's so profound about the Carlisle School, that the Carlisle School was created to remove Native Americans, indigenous populations, remove their cultural backgrounds, because Americans viewed them as kind of like savages, as beasts, as unequal. So the idea is that we're going to put them through our schools and we're going to train them with and instill them with our values and our cultures, right? So when we look at this image, these are all students who are from indigenous backgrounds and Native American communities who have been either captured or encouraged, oftentimes against their own will to participate in this school. And when I look at this image, it just obviously it saddens me deeply, because to recognize that all these students and all these young people were forced to go through this school where they weren't allowed to be their true selves, right? We have the young women, the young girls in the front sitting with their legs crossed, their hands up above their laps. We have all the men and the boys in the back, right? And nobody's smiling, nobody looks happy. But when we think about schooling and education, it should be an opportunity for students and young people to be creative, to really understand and make sense of who they are and the world around them. But this is not how school started and what the intention of schooling and public schooling across the nation was built for, right? When we think about the Carlisle School, it was often called the noble experiment. On the left, this is an image. These are the same people in both these images, right? So we have indigenous folks in their traditional garb. They have feathers. It looks like they're wearing feathered garb or outfits, more traditional. And then after they go through the Carlisle School, right, even like their faces are lighter, right? Their hair is cut. They have a part. The way that they're sitting, their stature is different, right? And this is important for us to recognize what schools across our nations do as to removing the culture of those who are already come from historically oppressed backgrounds and communities, right? So this is an example of the Carlisle School. And this is an example of how American schools are rooted in racism and continue, in a sense, to continue to do these things, right? Because if you're a student who does not necessarily align to traditional American values and you go through a public school system, more times than not, you're going to either remove yourself from that school system, find yourself removed by the school from that system, or you might find yourself forced to retain and look this way and have these values, these American values, right? We continue to think about the history of education across our nation. We think about the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Separate but equal, right? Schools, as long as, they were deemed equal by the state, it was okay for Blacks to go to their own school and whites to go to their own school. And for years and decades, Black folks across the country, specifically in the South, protested against these things. They thought that if their children were allowed to go to the schools, the white schools, where they had a lot more resources and opportunity, that their children will also have the same resources and opportunity. But when we look at the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s, early 1960s, we realized that, yes, they should be equal. Schools should be equal and schools should be integrated. But we recognize that the challenges that Black students and youth had to face once schools started to become integrated. This is an image of Elizabeth Eckford on the bottom right, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, one of 9 students who were integrating this public school, high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this was a whole big thing where the governor of Arkansas had to call in the National Guard to provide a way, because the community members did not want their schools to be integrated. Their images and accounts and anecdotes of folks spitting at these students, yelling at profound things at these Black students, all because they wanted quality education. There are accounts of these students going into the school in Little Rock, Arkansas, and teachers not wanting to teach them, sitting in classrooms by themselves. And ultimately, not all 9 students lasted in that school. A few of them graduated from that school, but not all of them lasted. And these are the effects and the responses of folks within our nation once folks are pushing to go and to have more racial justice, right? These are narratives, these are the stories across our nation. So I want to talk about Martin Luther King, right? Because today we honor Dr. King's legacy, and folks on social media, a lot of folks are posting quotes and thinking about his legacy. But this is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's important for us because it situates the context of where we are today as it relates to our current events and our educational system. And this quote from Dr. King reads, "To save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable us to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction." So it's very important for us to recognize that, yes, Dr. King was a nonviolent, he believed in nonviolence, but he also believed in racial justice, right? He fought for racial justice. He fought for economic justice. Dr. King was an enemy of the state, and he was assassinated while being an enemy of the state. And it's important for us not to forget these things as we remember his legacy. And in this quote, Dr. King is really calling on education and educators to really be critical, right? To encourage students to think about the world, the current events, and make sense of it, right? To question the world. And this quote really resonates with me when I think about and consider just where we are and where we're going and the recent context of our nation, right? We have the insurrection that happened about a week ago. I really wonder just how this story is being told in schools and how students are allowed to be critical of these incidences across our nation for just the last year, right? But also for the last couple of years. We think about police brutality, we think about economic injustice across our nation, we talk about racial injustice. And these are big umbrella things that infiltrate many systems and institutions across our nation that our young people are going to engage and participate in as they get older, right? Regardless of your background and who you are, it's important for all young people and students to be able to have an opportunity to make critical decisions and make sense of our current events in a context that will prepare them to be able to navigate these spaces in the future. So where do we go from here, right? It's important for us to recognize that racial justice racial justice is a systemic and fair treatment of people of all races, right? And the goal of racial justice is to have equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. But racial justice is not just the absence of discrimination, right? It's the idea that we're putting policies and rules into place that sustain racial equity, right? So we're not just going to pretend that the past didn't happen, but recognize that, that the insurrection occurred, police, Black folks are victimized by police at much higher rates than others. We have to come to terms with those things because these situations, this is the reality of our nation, and we have to look the reality of our nation, in its eye, but also take a critical stance, try to make sense of it, decipher it. Why do these things happen? Why are they occurring? And how are young people making sense of it and connecting their own personal experiences and realities to the current events of the nation? So young people have opportunities to talk about, racism or microaggressions that they've experienced, in schools and in their lives, on their way to school, on their way home, and what systems and structures are institutions like higher ed institutions like our own, K-12 schools, public schools. What policies and procedures are they putting in place to do racial justice work and to ultimately sustain it, right? So it's important for young people to take a critical look at ourselves and our loved ones, everyone, right? Let's question, let's do research, let's read books, let's read articles that demonstrate the experiences of historically oppressed groups so we can gain a better understanding of the challenges and the experiences that these groups have faced over time, and particularly over the last few years within our nation as we move forward to continue to honor Dr. King's legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edrupon.
Of course.
It's greatly appreciated. Just wondering in the area of questions, given your background, were there any recommendations, let's say, or suggestions you could even make, say, to the School of Education in terms of how the information you just presented can be incorporated to give a Seton Hall education major a unique entree to the issues you just identified?
Yeah, I think, there are many things that we can do. I think we have to, number one, try to understand the experiences of students of color across our campus and university, particularly in the College of Ed. And once we have an authentic understanding of those experiences, we can figure out how to adjust and navigate and make sure that those experiences become more positive. But then also, I think, there's a lot of work to do within policy across everywhere, right? Like, how do we ensure that the policies that we have in place are equitable for all, providing the same types of opportunities for all types of students, right? And ensure that, Black and Brown students just have the same opportunity as everyone else across our campus.
Very good. I want to thank you so much. And I hope that we'll begin at Seton Hall to turn out enlightened liberators. And not those who are subconsciously adding to the oppression of those young minds out there. But thank you so much.
Of course, thanks for the opportunity, Dr. Pritchett.
We will now turn our attention to the area of mass communications. If you graduate from a great university or college and you want to become a journalist or a news broadcaster or a news anchor, get your training and you go forward, but you go forward into a culture which in many cases may have its own agenda for what becomes the news and how that news is interpreted. And we have found that since the 1960s, those who aspire to liberate the, let's say, communications industry from the society's darkness when it comes to stereotypes, overgeneralizations about the questions of race and class and sex. So that after the 1960s, many African Americans who were a part of the journalism community began to form their own organization. While they were still part of the American Society of Journalists, if that was an organization, they formed the Association for Black Journalists. In today's world, we even have a Association of Latin Journalists, and it is most interesting that we not judge why these organizations exist, but that we listen to them, look at their analysis to see how in a democracy, the freedom of the press, freedom of expression, how it is consummated in their approach. And what are they saying about the institution of communication, the news, and so forth. So we've asked, and we are very pleased to have with us today from freepress.net, which is a Washington-based media conglomerate with very talented reporters and investigators and those who look at the industry as a culture. We're pleased to have with us Joseph Torres today. He comes highly recommended by our own Todd Burrows, Seton Hall graduate, and who now is a journalist extraordinaire. So, Joe, we want to welcome you with us this afternoon, and we are certainly looking forward to what you will be sharing with us. So, without further ado, Joe, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for having me, and I appreciate Todd inviting me to be able to talk today on this day in this MLK Symposium. So yeah, my name is Joseph Torres. I work for a group called Free Press, and we're a public interest group that works on. We write a lot. We write a lot about the media and race, and I do. I'm going to talk about something I wrote recently with colleagues in a second, a major essay. But we advocate for media and telecom policies to serve a public interest. and we don't take any money from government or corporations, and we try to make sure that the nation's laws and regulations actually serve a public good. And I can get into that more in a second. But Dr. King actually played a really important role in media policy, indirectly, but indirectly. He inspired the United Church of Christ. There was a man named Reverend Everett C. Parker, who was at the United Church of Christ and headed up the media advocacy organizations. And I believe it was in the late 1950s. He had a meeting with Dr. King, and he asked Dr. King, what can we do to help you in the civil rights struggle? And Dr. King told Dr. Parker, can you do something about those southern stations? They're giving us it's a really difficult time, the southern broadcast stations. So Dr. Parker set out to find a station that he can challenge the license of a broadcast station. And in Jackson, Mississippi, there was a station WLBT that the NAACP had for years have been writing to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the government agency that oversees telecom policy, media and telecom policy, to do something about this station, because the station was run by the general manager was a member of the White Citizens Council. And he dedicated his airwaves, just like a lot of Southern broadcasters on radio and television, to the prevention of integration. So the messages coming from this station was from white segregationists, members of the White Citizens Council, and so forth. Medgar Evers, another civil rights icon, his legacy is not known as well in this aspect as well. He was helping to lead the fight of the NAACP in Mississippi to challenge this broadcast station, WLBT, and he asked for time on the air to challenge the racism happening in the station, and was finally granted in 1963. And he got on the air, and for 17 minutes he challenged the racism on this station. And his wife and friends were really concerned about this, because no one really has seen him before on the air or heard his voice, and it made him a bigger target. And less than a month after he appeared on WLBT, he was assassinated in his driveway. So the following year, getting back to Dr. Parker, he took up the challenge with the local NAACP and other groups and activists in Jackson to challenge the broadcast license WLBT. Why this is important, because U.S. citizens at the time did not have legal standing to challenge a broadcast license. Even though the public airways are owned by the people, you had no right to actually challenge a broadcast license. But in 1966, a federal court ruled that for the first time ever, the court ruled that the U.S. citizens in the case could move forward because they had standing. Now they had a legal standing to challenge a broadcast license. This changed media policy in our country going forward, and why my groups like mine now exist. Years in the next few years after that, in the late 1960s, 1970s, Black and Latino groups primarily throughout the country were challenging broadcast licenses all over the country for failure to serve the community, for its racism. And that led to agreements that broadcast stations had to make with the community with promises to improve coverage, to hire folks. It was the first mass integration of our airwaves in our nation's history, right? It was like the first time that we've seen local anchors that were anchors on local television stations were there for years and years. Like I was on a panel with John Quinones, for example, and he said he got on the air in 1969 in San Antonio because of a license challenge that happened with the Chicano groups there. This happened all throughout the country. It was an assault, broadcasting a cable called it, on the airways by Black and Latino activists to integrate and democratize our media system. Here we are now, all these years. It also led to changes in media ownership rules and so forth and so on. But here we are, almost 50 years later, right? 50 years later. And after the George Floyd protest, there was a racial reckoning happening throughout the country, but also in our nation's newsrooms. We saw this summer that the Los Angeles Times apologized for its racist coverage, history of racist coverage. The Kansas City Star, prior to the Christmas holidays apologized for the racist coverage. And so after these 50 years and after the Kerner Commission report that came out that talked about the role of media in fomenting racial violence in the racial uprisings of 1967, and the pressure on this industry to democratize their newsrooms and the creation of the National Association of Black Journalists, Hispanic journalists, and all this pressure on the industry to change, there's still enormous inequities. And when it comes to media policy, there's still in 2017 only 12 TV stations nationwide, full power TV stations, were owned by Black folks. So what we have, the reckoning, there's still a reckoning that needs to happen with the history of our media system, and the thing is that anti-Black racism has always been a central part of our media system's DNA since the inception. My colleagues and I, in October, we published an essay calling the Black Caucus at my organization, published an essay calling for media reparations, right? And the idea of how do we reconcile, repair the history of harm that our media institutions have caused. We take the very first continuous newspaper in our country was the Boston Newsletter in the early 1700s. Within a month of this publication, they had a slave ad, right? They talked about Black folks being addicted to stealing and lying. Newspapers were complicit in the slave trade by profiting off the chattel slavery, with the printer of the paper being the broker between the seller and the buyer. And when they print slave notices in the paper, racial terrorism newspapers took part in. In fomenting violence, as Isabel Wilkerson wrote in her book, The War for Other Sons. Newspapers were giving Black folks top billing, the most breathless outrage reserved for any rumor of Black male indiscretion toward a white woman, all but guaranteeing a lynching. So newspaper promoted this, and the reason we talk about it, just to move forward, is that the function of our news media, dominate white-controlled news media, has always been and continues to be to uphold a white racial hierarchy. It's continued to serve that purpose. So we have and also, like, we have a media system. We have a de facto media apartheid system, where those who create and control the creation and distribution of stories and narratives are controlled by white dominant media companies, and that's still true today. We talk about, like, we have to deal with this history in our essay, this history of harm caused by media institutions, because this is a democracy fight. The fight is a fight over narrative. Narrative has been used throughout the history of media being weaponized, right? In the stories that are told, and the creation of the myth of Black inferiority, and that Black folks are advantages to society. All this has been supported by the narrative of the dominant white media institutions, right? And this is why we see this summer the racial reckoning again. It is 2021 now, 2020, 2021, and the fight and the struggle in newsrooms across the country still remains the very same fight that Black folks have been fighting for ever since the first Black newspaper was founded in 1827, Freedom's Journal, right? Wish to plead our own cause, as the paper said. So the issue of narrative and the issue of anti-Black racism being a central component of narrative in order to hold a white racial caste system, a white racial hierarchy and a caste system in our country, we have to deal with when it comes to the future of, like, the future of democracy in our country. Are we going to truly fulfill? Are we going to fulfill Are we going to be the idea that it's a multiracial democracy even possible in our country? And it's going to be hard to change that, as you see with today. When you see the social media and companies that profit off of racism by the amplification of hate with their algorithms, right? Or news organizations that continue to, Les Moonves, the former head of CBS, when Trump was running for president in 2016, after he made all these racist comments and all that, was saying Trump may be bad for America, but he's great for CBS, right? How do we create media reparations that give the Black community, Black folks, the ability, the finances, the resource to create and control their own distribution, to create their own media platforms, to be able to inform folks as opposed to going through gatekeepers. One of the things that haunts me is like a couple of years ago, I was listening to a panel by this scholar named Tarso Luis Ramos, who studies white nationalism and authoritarianism. And he said that in the short history of the modern nation state, it's hard to identify an example when a democracy survived the transition in which the dominant racial, ethnic, or religious group became a numerical minority. More typically, democracy is sacrificed in order to maintain the cultural, economics, and political dominance of that class. So the fight for a just media system, the fight for media reparations, right, as my organization is fighting for, and for a more equitable media system, is a democracy fight. It is a racial justice fight. I fight for racial justice through fighting for a more just media system. And how can we be a healthy democracy? As I mentioned these statistics, when Black and Latino folks control very little of our public airways, very little of the broadcast, on very few broadcast stations, on very few cable networks, do not control broadband platforms, right? We're always using someone else's platform, who either tell our story and tell it wrong, and that causes great harm, or they don't tell the stories that need to be told. So in order for us to fight to achieve racial justice in our country, we have to deal with the narrative, a weaponized narrative that's been weaponized for hundreds of years through a dominant white-controlled media system. I'll end with this, Dr. Pritchett. This is something that Dr. Cain wrote in his last book, Community, where do we go from here, Chaos or Community? He addresses the media and other things, but media is like any other institution in this country that's been created, any other system in our country, whether it's, as we talk about the health system or the education system, media is like any other institution, system that was created that wasn't created to help Black folks, then by extension, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, so forth and so on. It was there to preserve a white, it's always there to serve a white racial hierarchy. So as we talk about, this is what Dr. King said in his last book, that this is a fight for democracy and equity, right? He wrote, with Selma and Voting Rights Act, one phase of development in the civil rights revolution came to an end. A new phase opened, but few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase, had been a struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not of equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, and all other forms of discrimination. The outraged white citizen had been sincere when he snatched the whips from the Southern sheriffs and forbade them for more cruelties. But when this degree accomplished, the emotions that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground in devastating numbers and walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationist and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. When Negroes looked for a second phase, a realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. The Negroes of America had taken the president, the press, and the pulpit at their word when they spoke of broad reform and justice. But the absence of brutality and unregenerated evil is not the presence of justice. Sustained murder is not the same to ordained brotherhood. The word was broken and the free-running expectations of Negroes crashed into the stone walls of white resistance. The result was havoc. And so we're dealing with the fight of like realizing reconstruction, realizing reconstruction of a country that never dealt with trying to put a country back together again. And with the history of racism, capitalism, and empire, how to make democracy fully realized by all. And our media system, again, has played a role because last thing I'll say, when you could dehumanize people with a narrative, you can pass public policy that harms folks in all sorts of areas. You can, and so I'll stop there. So I'll stop there. So thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for inviting me, and I try to fit in a lot in a few minutes. So sorry about
Joe, that was excellent. You've helped to paint the picture for us of how something that we all think is free, the free press, it can be used and has been used for over 100 years to reinforce the stereotypes of the culture. I can remember just growing up in America when we turned on and my parents are watching the 6 o'clock news. Every story we ever heard about Black folks was something that was negative and who was getting locked up. So thank you for giving us that penetrating insight. I do have one question for you,
Yeah.
and it might come in the form of a recommendation. If you were making a recommendation to schools of communication in terms of how they are training and producing the next generation of news broadcasters, those who produce the news, write the news, and journalists, public relations specialists, what kind of recommendations would you make for the training of those students?
Well, like I think the stuff that we're talking about here, has to be taught. So many journalists and journalists of color, Black journalists, Latino journalists, this history I'm talking about and the history of racism in our own industry, they do not know about. These institutions where they train, amazing Black journalists are taught through a white lens. And folks go out into the world, they know about history of racism potentially in other sectors, right? It's amazing that journalists know a lot about, journalists of color have done the work and been educated, and they know about history of racism in other sectors, but they don't know about it in their own industry and how it shapes their work. The fact that we have media policies that determine who owns stuff, right? And their owners, the folks they work for, are very engaged in trying to change policy to create greater inequities in our media system, mass concentration, companies like Comcast that owns every kind of platform. And journalists don't do a good enough job covering or advocating for their own industry because they're unaware of how it functions and how it works and the media policies and the policy fights. And so they'll fight for issues of the First Amendment, right? But when it comes to who owns these platforms and how they're going to use them to a better society, that is not very well taught in school, though. And so I would argue for more institutions to really teach that, because that shapes journalism. That shapes the kind of stories they can tell. And that's my initial thought.
Thank you so much. So if I were summarizing that myself, it would be an analysis of power and privilege in the delivery of information and communications to the American public. Thank you so much for being with us. We wish you Godspeed in all of your great work. I'm now very pleased to introduce one of our prestigious colleagues and an ally in this effort of liberation for long term. Dr. King-Mott is the current chairperson of the Political Science Department at Seton Hall University. And he looks very carefully at the intersectionality of many issues and how their collective impact needs to be analyzed and understood, particularly by those who simply take their existence for granted in America. So what does that mean? So Dr. Mott is going to really help us to understand how we some of us, or just take ourselves for granted in everyday life in America. Dr. Mott, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. And one of the great things about this experience of sitting in the middle of this program is that it has obliterated my PowerPoint because my colleagues have used all of my materials. So I have some information that I'm going to talk about, and in this way, hopefully hit at a curve, perhaps, from what we have been discussing. And so I'd like to start with, the working assumption to all of you tuned in today is often that we need dialogue. We need to just get along. And what I want to suggest to you that from the social science literature in critical race and in critical gender theory, it's simply not working. There's a lot published right now about white fragility. And without going into great detail, I would just like particularly for the white people who are listening in to this conversation, to consider this possibility. Politeness, and this is directly from D'Angelo's White Fragility. Politeness as filtered through fragility and supremacy isn't about manners. It's about controlling the conversation. And so my discussion today with all of us begins with the notion that somehow these grand myths, and yes, I will be very critical here, that includes religious mythology. It includes the canon in higher education and in high school. The books you read, that's a fancy word. The books that are assigned to be read. The people that are assigned to be able to quote. All of that is raced. Now, we simply approach it, black, white, brown, and other, as, history, because you're a third grader and they give you a book. But the politics of the creation of that book for the average third grader are white-centric, they are male-centric, they are Christocentric. And that is an academic way of saying they are biased. Does it mean that they're wrong? Does it mean that the people who created them are bad people? That's beside the point, and that confuses the conversation. The fact of the matter is they are selected, just like the Gospels were selected. In a deliberative political act, that the Gospels that people know that are Christian, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're called the Synoptic Gospels, and I'll go to my more esteemed colleagues in religious studies, but they tell basically the same stories. The outliers weren't put in there. Religion, all of the great religions of this world participate actively in oppression. Now, does that mean that all religion is bad and all ministers, and my good friend Reverend Dr. Pritchett here is part of that, are part of a system that is inclined to perpetuate certain access and certain systematic considerations? No. But if we fool ourselves to think that somehow just loving each other because we're all Christian, or because we're all Muslim, or we're all Jewish, or we're all children of God, minimizes. James Baldwin was emphatic about this notion. He wrote, "To not see me as a black gay man is to erase me." And we white people love to get in conversations where we just, we associate racism with, violent acts. And we say, I'm not part of that. I didn't live back in enslavement times. I don't participate. I have black friends. And what the research is showing around that kind of conversation is that it is a way of making the conversation of race polite. And that is a way of ensuring supremacy, white supremacy. So, Baldwin was very clear. Another important idea he wrote, which I think will help us in this conversation a bit. He said to all people, and he meant it literally, if we have to decide who we are, then we are going to have to make that decision visible and force it upon the world to deal with us as constructed people. So getting along with everybody, I'm one of those scholars and one of those faculty people who does not believe that we should harm. Who among us really wants to bring harm? But sometimes this conversation is going to hurt. And sometimes it's going to be extraordinarily uncomfortable. And sometimes it takes white people to bring the discomfort to other white people who want to say, look at me, I'm sitting here listening to an MLK Day. I'm going to go today and shop at a Black-owned business. All the while not addressing the systematic realities that perpetuate these kinds of problems. So something that's important, and it's not bad about Seton Hall. Seton Hall is an incredible faculty, and like all administrations, good administrations. But if you noticed, all the high ups, they're white. If you look at American colleges and universities, and you look at presidents and provosts, and you look at they're white. If you look at deans, they're white. If you look at tenured faculty, we are white. So that is indicative of a system that must be addressed in difficult ways. And I'll give you an example of how this works in higher education. So everybody puts into their ad, you know, we're affirmative action interested people. But we don't go to historical Black institutions in America and find our candidates. We don't even recognize that some of the means of distributing our advertisements don't reach certain people. And so what we say is that we are engaged in affirmative action, but what we do is very different. We perpetuate a racial supremacy, just as Robin DiAngelo's suggested. So the way that radical race theory and radical gender theory works is the first step. And so Reverend Dr. Pritchett has often asked my colleagues, you know, what do you do? The first thing that we have to acknowledge is that whiteness and white is a race. We live in a raced society. And today we have been addressing Black and brown and some gender stuff and some class stuff. But we haven't yet acknowledged that white people exist in this raced society too. White people exist in this raced society differently. And whiteness is a hegemonic notion. It even imposes itself into Black and brown culture, so that more white than dark may seem better in some way, which speaks to what Dr. Pritchett spoke about earlier, how race and our identities are part of a social construction of power. Politics is defined by David Easton as who gets what, when, and how. There's the basis argument. It's about power. And every one of my colleagues and peers that have spoken today, and those dancers that danced this morning, and yes, even the president of the university, is acknowledging that there is a problem. Perhaps we may have been deferring too much to politeness and solidarity. I do not doubt the potential for extraordinary relationship. I do not doubt the potential for friendship, both in an intimate and in a philosophical sense. But I do doubt these kinds of experiences that stay in the kind of capsule that so often they can stay in. Well, we did an MLK Day. Check. That is harmful. Audre Lorde pointed that out consistently in her discussion of the hierarchy of power. and in her discussions of intersectionality. There is, and there must come out of this discussion, action. The correspondence between Malcolm and Martin was often conflicted. And then the white narrative liked to make Malcolm the bad one and, Martin the good one. Black, the good black, the bad black. They mistook it, because if you read carefully, King was extraordinarily clear that the commitment to Christianity is radical. It is not a balm that will soothe and will forgive. It demands action. It demands participation. It demands sacrifice, personal sacrifice. I'll conclude with this notion that to give you some more food for thought, sometimes we come to these crises like this past summer. Oh my gosh. And all you see in the social media is I'll pray for them. Well, that and whatever a token cost in New York City now is about as valuable. It doesn't mean anything. It may make the person who's saying it, and usually they're white, it may make us feel better because, we're not one of those bad ones. But until we engage the impact of a raced society that includes being white, includes being male, includes being classed, and begin, like AOC is talking about in Congress now, begin a conversation of deconstructing the institutions that perpetuate the advantages of that particular kind of community. Until we do that, until I do that, until I participate in the difficult conversations, because I value people enough to have those conversations. Racism and the systematic, insidious complications of racism. Only look at our prisons if you want some data. It will not only continue, it will prosper and it will expand. Thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for this opportunity to discuss this and bring into a conversation on Martin Luther King Day, not just African Americans, but white Americans from a critical point of view, not a sympathetic point of view.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mott, for your honesty and your integrity all of these years. But I'd also like to ask you, it's the question, what more can an institution of higher learning do as we turn out graduates? Do we have a responsibility, in a sense, to a, quote, higher commitment to values in those graduates and actions?
Well, I would respond. I see my colleague, Dr. Harris, coming on, and so he's going to make me look bad because he always does such better work than me. But what I would say is, why don't we have an African American Studies department? Why don't we have a commitment beyond papering the wall, financial commitment to having Black and brown students see themselves in the curriculum? And I don't mean that just Black politics, but look at the canon that we use in all of our philosophy courses. Look at the books that are read. Every one of our students go through. We have not carefully examined what we consider to be valuable. And so until we as individual scholars and teachers begin to look at our own explicit and implicit bias in the way that we teach, Dr. Pritchett,
Yes, sir.
and what we use to teach, it ain't going anywhere. Nothing will change, and Black and brown people will sit in white people's classes, nervous because they're going to have to answer the question about race at some point during the semester. Until we change the power differential through demonstrative action, nothing changes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to also take the moment to probably say that I'll, between you and I, we could shoot a recommendation over to the university, the brand new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and the subcommittee on training, which I think coincidentally you're sharing the screen with the chairman of that committee. Dr. Harris happens to be the chair of the DEI training committee, but for further review and perhaps recommended implementation. But I think getting the majority of the faculty of the university to participate, to buy into that process, would make us appear to be, of the 4,500 institutions of higher learning in America, we might be looking very progressive if we could take the national lead in that effort. So Dr. Mott, thank you once again for making a brilliant, clear, transparent contribution to the MLK Symposium for 2021. Thank you. All right. I see Dr. Harris has rejoined us, and we extend, as you can tell from his dress, he thought it not appropriate to get, but we know that he's coming off of a, I think the funeral service for the pastor of the church, where about 1 year ago this week, when he was scheduled to be with us, the transition of his mother took him out of our midst. So we are so pleased to have him with us. As you know, this morning, Dr. Harris started off with a description of the civil rights movement. He's now going to continue that presentation by looking at, be it the civil rights movement, to fill in any additional gaps he'd like us to be involved with. And then we'll be entertaining a Q&A period. So Dr. Harris, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank my chair of my department, political science department, King Mott, for his great presentation. I thought he raised some excellent points, and hopefully I can build on those and be as courageous as he was in the challenge he put forth before us. But I'm going to do a short PowerPoint, only 6 slides, and I want us to grapple with Dr. King, really with where he was going and what he was attempting to do. Because one of the things that bothers me, and I think it bothers many of you from listening to your presentations, is that when we have these King Day celebrations, we really don't grapple with his ideas and what he was challenging, the challenge he was putting forth before the nation. And if we're ever really, there's always these conversations, we always talk about having a national conversation. And Dr. King's name is always introduced. And I Have a Dream is always introduced. A Letter from a Birmingham Jail is always introduced. But if we don't widen our scope, broaden our scope, and really grapple with his ideas in many of his speeches and his books, then we really are doing a disservice to his legacy. So let me begin and share my very brief PowerPoint. And I'm going to actually begin by this poem. This is a favorite poem of mine, which was written not long after Dr. King was assassinated. But this poem by Carl Wendell Hines really grapples with what I'm trying to get at in terms of how we deal with Dr. King. Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him, build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes, for they cannot rise to challenge the images that we might fashion from their lives. It is easier to build monuments than to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we with ease consciences will teach our children that he was a great man, knowing that the cause for which he lived is still a cause and the dream for which he died is still a dream, a dead man's dream. Now, if we unpack this, build monuments to his glory, we built a monument for Dr. King. Dead men make such convenient heroes. Dr. King, at the time of his assassination, his approval rating in the United States was under 20%. Now, it's national holidays. He's a hero. Everybody from the far left to the far right quotes Dr. King and talks about Dr. King. Everybody loves him. But again, dead men make such convenient heroes. for they cannot rise to challenge the images that we might fashion from their lives. It is easier to build monuments than to build a better world. And that's really what we have to grapple with. The challenge that Dr. King really gave us was trying to build a better world. And you can't do that just by building monuments, right? So what was his discussion? Where was he at? So the last 4 years of his life, and I use this really because we have to think, remember, in historiography, and Dr. Green can help me out here, in civil rights historiography for a long time, they talked about 1965 maybe being the end of the civil rights movement. And they used that date because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And prior to that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So coming off the two major victories of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. King heads north to Chicago, right? And now you see the sermons and the lectures and the speeches that he gave over the last 4 years of his life. And the question we have to ask, how many of these do we unpack? How many do we unpack? We talk about I've been to the mountaintop. And that's really, in the terms of the public, that's the only one we talk about. We talk about a time to break silence, but people really don't listen to the whole speech or read the whole speech. A time to break silence was when he came out against the Vietnam War. So we really have to go back, and I'm challenging the students, I'm challenging my colleagues, I'm challenging the administrators. If we really want to deal with Dr. King, let's delve into his speeches in addition to and build on I Have a Dream and a letter from a Birmingham jail. Let's deal with the whole corpus of his thought if we really want to honor and celebrate Dr. King, because I think that's what he really charges us to do. So when we look at his last year of his life, and these are some snippets from a couple speeches of the last year of life. Remember, he was assassinated April 4th, March 10th, 1968. When there is massive unemployment in the Black community, it's called a social problem. But when there is massive unemployment in the white community, it is called a depression. Malcolm X could have said that. We look around every day and we see thousands and millions of people making inadequate wages. Not only do they work in our hospitals, they work in our hotels, they work in our laundries, they work in domestic service, they find themselves underemployed. You see, no labor is really menial unless you're not getting adequate wages. People are always willing to talk about menial labor, but if you're getting a good wage, as I know that through some unions, they've brought it up, that isn't menial labor. What makes it menial is the income, the wages. And this was a theme, and I'm highlighting 1968, but Dr. King really talked about this through all of the 1960s. I could go back to his speeches in 1961 that he made for labor unions. Dr. King was reaching out to labor unions and trying to work with them and really holding their feet to the fire and saying that you all are identifying with race over your class interests when we have the same interests in terms of labor. When we look at a speech in Memphis, Tennessee, and this is why he made this speech and then decided to come back on April 4th. Now you're doing something else here. You're highlighting the economic issue. You are going beyond purely civil rights to questions of human rights. That is a distinction. And I want to remind people from earlier, I mentioned that Dr. King and Malcolm X had agreed to work on Malcolm's challenge of charging the United States of human rights violations and not simply civil rights. And Dr. King liked that idea. That idea was broached in June of 1964. And Dr. King's lawyer was there, Harry Belafonte was there, the Portiers were there, Juanita and Sidney Portier, Lorraine Hansberry, a couple other Black civil rights leaders, and Malcolm X. And Malcolm X shared the idea of charging the United States of human rights violation. And Dr. King, through his lawyer, thought that was a good idea. And Dr. King was willing to work on that. And from that time on, you see Dr. King talking about economic issues and human rights issues, and not simply civil rights. And the fact that he would continue to do that after the Voting Rights Act was passed and not just focus on voting and electoral politics, a lot of people in the civil rights movement left Dr. King. And that's something we have to remember. Dr. King felt very alone at the last year of his life. Some folk talk about him being depressed, and he wasn't well liked from all sectors. And people in the civil rights movement, his own movement, started moving away from him. because he continued to press these economic issues and talked about human rights. In his last sermon, it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. It is criminal to have people working on a full-time basis and full-time job getting part-time income. Now we can start. Now, how do we get into a critique of Amazon, of Walmart, and other institutions of that ilk? How do we get into these institutions where people work full-time but still receive starvation wages, still need food stamps, and still need help? How do we deal with that? Dr. King was asking us he was challenging us to deal with that back in 1968. He challenged us to have a living wage for people, and not just a minimum wage. So we really have to go back and again take a look at that. His last planned sermon, Dr. King, in his last planned sermon, and this is called from scholars who are looking at what he was working on and the sermons leading up to it. If America doesn't use its vast resources and wealth to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor nations, and between the rich and poor in this nation, it too was going to hell. Now, a key thing here is that you need to pay attention to. He said, bridge the gap between the rich and poor nations, not simply in America. Not simply in America, right? And again, that's something that Dr. King was called to do and called us to do. So Dr. King couldn't said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he could never consider himself wealthy as long as another individual is living in poverty. And he didn't mean just an individual in the United States. He meant everywhere, everywhere. So it's not enough for us just to be concerned about our own little neck of the woods. We have to be concerned about people in the farthest parts of the world. We have to be concerned about poverty in India, just as we are poverty in Newark, New Jersey. All those things are very important. And for Dr. King, that's what he was called to do, and that's what he was challenging us to do. And that's the thing that I really wanted to highlight. How do I end this thing here? Where I'm at? That's the thing that I want us to take away from this and focus on. How do I stop sharing? Here we go. And that's what I really want the students to consider, and our community to consider when we're celebrating Dr. King. Let's think about where he was and what he was challenging us to do. And let's not just go with the cliches that we might hear on network television when people are quoting from the same speech, I have a dream, and maybe a letter from a Birmingham jail. And hopefully there are questions and we can have some dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I think one thing I could probably start with would be if you were making, say, additional recommendations beyond today in the context of, let's say, your position as the chairperson of the community training component of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. How would you see the agenda for that training committee reflecting what we have done today?
Well, my colleague and friend, King Mott, said it very well. What is the role of Africana Studies going to be at the university? So when we start, remember now, diversity and inclusion, Africana Studies, it came out of the whole need to diversify higher education. And sometimes people forget that. In this discussion about diversity and inclusion, and I'm being honest, a lot of Africana Studies scholars feel like this discussion about diversity and inclusion is marginalizing Africana Studies, because Africana Studies was there at the beginning, talking about diversity and inclusion when people weren't willing to talk about it. So I think that when we deal with diversity and inclusion, and particularly in terms of our agenda, is what is the role of Africana Studies going to be at Seton Hall University? Is it going to be something that we really embrace and engage in and say is important for all of our students? And for me, that's where we have to start, and that's where we should start.
You know, many parents and students prior to them engaging with college majors might be thinking the following: what kind of a job can I get with a degree in African American or Africana Studies? How would you respond to that?
They say the same thing about political science. They say the same thing about history. In some cases, they say the same thing about English. But I'm gonna stick to the social sciences. Africana Studies, depending on the skill sets of the people who are teaching it, It could be a social science or in the humanities. I'm a social scientist. What does social scientists prepare students to do? We prepare them to think critically. We prepare them to identify problems. We prepare them to identify solutions to problems. We prepare them to work with people from a variety of backgrounds. These are the types of things that these skill sets come from this. So you can do with a degree in Africana Studies the same thing you can do with any social science degree. Same thing. And in fact, it really does help students from all backgrounds prepare them for the workforce, for working for people from diverse backgrounds.
Thank you so much. In closing out, do you have any final thoughts? And where do we go from here?
And that's the thing that Dr. King said. I think maybe that should be maybe 1 year, maybe that should be a book that we should all read for the university. Where do we go from here? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a challenge that we have for our incoming freshman class. We have them read, where do we go from here? So we can all really meditate on what Dr. King was challenging us, and not just snippets from a speech here or there, not just a line from I Have a Dream. Let's read his work and let's deal with it. And I want to be clear. That doesn't mean we have to agree. That doesn't mean that we have to sit back and applaud Dr. King and say we agree with everything that he did and said. We have to grapple. We can't put anybody on a pedestal. We have to really take people seriously, treat their ideas seriously, critique them, and that's it. And we move on from there. That's the way we build. That's the way we move forward.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening period, and we, as always, we thank all of my colleagues for their participation this afternoon. Thank you so much. We're now going to turn to a topic which I hope is timely for many. I'm going to hopefully share my screen in a moment and get my presentation up there. Bear with me, please. Domestic terrorism, probably a phrase that for many people, they've only been hearing for the last few months. But for many of us, this has been something that we have lived with. Before I begin this, I'd just like to weave a narrative into an introduction. Many people have actually, throughout history in this country, have actually portrayed the struggle and the drive of the African American population. They have labeled that, labeled us as activists, terrorists, rather evil people who are seeking those rights which have been guaranteed perhaps under the Constitution. And we've had to live with that labeling for far too long, when actually the real enemy was the enemy from within. I remember growing up in post-World War II America, in which I've often told my colleagues this story, so I hope it will make some sense. But in terms of understanding the realities that we as African Americans have lived with, I remember as a pre-teenager looking at my grandmother and her stewardship over the family. I say her stewardship because I didn't really see, I had no grandfather, no grand uncles, or no older men in the family. And who was my family? I'm talking about my mother, who, along with her mother, moved up to New Jersey from the sharecropping fields in North Carolina in the late 1930s. My mother at the time, my future mother, was 16 years old. During World War II, she married, and they conceived a son. But within the decade plus, as I'm becoming a pre-teenager, I began to notice in the family, I see my grandmother, I see my mother, and I see my three other aunts. and their husbands, but there are no older men. And as I raised the question, as a little boy might, about, where are these guys? Who are they? Are they still in North Carolina? The women would get a little bit agitated. And I'm wondering, what did I do? What did I say? But they could not even come to explain to me what I was touching upon as a subject, because for them, it wasn't just a matter of why are there no men. It was about explaining what had actually happened to those men. But those women felt so terrorized decades later that they could never come to explain to this little boy what the reality actually was. That reality, my friends, just deals with how the establishment, the system in this nation has responded to the African presence. I can remember 1 year ago, in the year 2019, we were commemorating the 400th anniversary of the importation of African slave labor by the English at the Jamestown colony, starting from 1619. Some many years ago, as an undergraduate, I actually came across some other information as a result of me putting in the time to want to find out when, because when we went to high school, we were fundamentally informed that black folks on the plantations never really rebelled against the system.
Yes, so
we took it rather passively, and so these are the notions that we all grow up with. So that consequently, by the time we were in high school, when it came to discussing that chapter in the book, the history book, we wanted to slide under the chairs and hide in plain sight, because we really knew that we were about to touch upon that evil thing that makes us all somewhat inferior to our white classmates. Here we are, just teenagers. But what happened? When did it occur? And what was it all about? So what I did find out in that quest, I was looking to find out, when did Africans get introduced to this North American continent, and by whom and when? And I really found out, as many of you would know if you understand the history of the development, so to speak, through colonization of North America, that the Spanish were here long before the English. So at some point, I discovered that in 1526, in one of the sea islands off of Georgia, the Spanish were attempting to develop an area as a colony, so to speak. And they had at their disposal 100 Africans. And early on in that experience, those Africans rebelled. They rebelled successfully. And that colony, the colonizing effort ended up failing. So in my own mind, and given all of the developments around this, I'm beginning now to push a number of colleagues to say that in the year 2026, we need to make sure that there is some not only commemoration, but we need to overcome this myth that indeed the slaves just accepted their plight, because great amount of terrorism was used to convert these Africans who came from noble backgrounds on the African continent, to convert them into what we would call, slaves. No one is born a slave, except if you happen to have been born on a plantation. And then you have to be literally converted. You must be socialized. You have to be educated into this new mindset of what does it mean to be a Negro, or more precisely, a nigger, in quotes. What does that mean? Well, a nigger is a social construction of an inferior person. It wasn't constructed by those of African descent. It was designed by those who wanted to control this product that they had imported into this nation to make it a capitalist power. I remember reading a book during that period of time by Du Bois. And, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American, I believe, to get a PhD in history from Harvard University. Du Bois recognized upon his graduation that when you do receive a Doctor of Philosophy degree and you defend your dissertation in front of probably the entire, if not just the entire department of history at Harvard, they might have invited all of the faculty to sit there so that you really know that you know your stuff. But he realized that he had been somewhat robbed from his point of view. But on the other hand, he said maybe it's not robbery in that he learned nothing about Africa during his stay at Harvard, working on his doctorate. So either that's by design at that point in time, and now we're talking about the late 1890s that he completes his work at Harvard. So immediately upon leaving, he decides to attend some European universities where he believes there are the resources and expertise that would help to explain to him and so forth. Where did Africa come from? What was the role of Africa in world civilization? Who are the African people? What were their contributions? As a result of him completing that additional, you might say, postdoctorate work, he published a small book called The Negro, which really talks about all of African civilization, up to the point where it talks about how African civilizations were being dismantled as a result of the North Atlantic slave trade. Now, the world had seen slavery for thousands of years prior to that throughout all parts of the world, or every continent had been touched by this. But Du Bois labeled the North Atlantic slave trade one of the most virulent, violent forms of the enslavement of people, not only their bodies, but their minds. And one of the last couple of chapters in his book, he says, and it's a great quote, one of the great tragedies of the African and the New World experience is that African or Negro, and who is a Negro? Well, a Negro is an African who's been so terrorized that the new product that emerges in terms of the mentality is a Negro, someone who no longer understands his African languages, his African cultures, his African customs. But he has been socially constructed into something totally different, something that's alien to himself. Du Bois goes on to state that the real tragedy is going to be that African enslaved labor will have been used to build the world's greatest capitalistic economy. But during that process, the African will have never been taught the skill necessary to survive in the very economy that they created. I was so touched by those comments that I began to make Du Bois my hero in that intellectual sense and begin to follow his work. But if we follow that thesis, that would mean that unless somebody made extraordinary efforts at some point in time to, if not rehabilitate, to retrain, but to see to it that according to the Constitution of the US, that these Americans of African descent could be brought into a full equitable position within the American economic structure. Unless that happens, these people would be doomed to wither, as Du Bois would say, in the very economy that they created. Once you understand that thesis, it's very simple to understand then how the dominant power structure in this country may have been determined and predestined to make sure that they forever and ever keep people of African descent in this nation in their place. And what is their place? That place is not to be self-determined by African Americans. It is to be determined by the power structure. So with that introduction in mind, I can begin this further discussion. So once again, as a young man, I see no older men, but those older men had been taken out by the nature of domestic terrorism. Some people today are coming to call that anti-blackness, because it isn't directed just at people of color. It very specifically is being directed at these historical periods in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, at Black folks, to see that they will never, ever be fully free to realize the American dream. And this is how Dr. King embraces and captures all of this for ourselves, as I will read it for all. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original Americans, the Indian as many of us had called them, now the indigenous population, I would say, of North America, when the dominant population then begins to refer to this indigenous population as an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes in our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. Judge Leon Higginbotham, in his book called In the Matter of Color, Higginbotham was a federal circuit judge out of the federal courts of Philadelphia. At some point, he decided to take a look at it and document every code, every law, every regulation that was ever written that attempted to hold the Negro in their place. In other words, the thesis might be that when you come to America, the Constitution guarantees everyone the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of mobility, if that's the case. As a legal jurist, Higginbotham knows that indeed specific codes during the colonial period, for example, were written that it contained the word Negro, not used to free the Negro from bondage, but to keep the Negro in bondage. And in his book, In the Matter of Color, he documented the fact that well over 10,000 of these codes and little laws had been developed during the colonial period alone. So when anyone ever asks me, why don't we just get off of it and stop talking all of this black stuff, advancement and all the inequality, stop crying over it and just get over it. And like all the other immigrant groups, just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, we had no boots and no straps on the boots. And unlike any other so-called immigrant group, whether someone came voluntarily or involuntarily, we were the only group for whom, as he documented, thousands and thousands of regulations were written to retard our social progress. He goes on to state, Dr. King, from the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. So he's now referring to the following. And from the time any outsiders set themselves down on this soil, from the Spanish to the English, and the English specifically, once the indigenous population helped some of the immigrants, particularly from England, to establish themselves here, within a matter of 100 years or so, when we began to think about empire building, then we realized that those indigenous nations, and let's put a face on those nations. I often ask my students, gee whiz, how many of them were here? How were they organized or disorganized? Were they savage or civilized? Most people get it wrong every time. How many were here? Best estimates would say millions of them. How were they organized? Well, I ask my students, how many states do we have? Well, we have about 50 plus a few territories. We're up to like 55 altogether. The indigenous nations of North America had well over 500 different groupings. They were not grouped just geographically, they're grouped by their collective work and locational responsibilities. 500 different groupings, ranging from, if we did it alphabetically, from the Apache, Comanche, Blackfoot, Iroquois, Sioux, Comanche, Lakota. By the time I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, and I started reading about the survival of those indigenous nations, I was informed that they were down to less than 100,000 or more. And one of the things that I read in the 1960s was an indigenous person activist who was really thanking God for the presence of the American Civil Rights Movement, because that movement was breathing life back into the survival of the indigenous peoples of North America. Moreover, we elevated that tragic, as Dr. King says, experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt our children are still being taught to respect the violence which reduced the red-skinned population and people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded into impoverished reservations. That's Dr. King speaking to us from the past. We thank God that those populations are still attempting their struggles today. And this is how we would introduce the topic for you all. Several years ago, as was mentioned even earlier, Reverend Jim Wallace produced this volume, which ties together all of the period of time that I just spoke of. America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege. And Reverend Wallace is showing us how we can create that bridge to a new America. You know, many people thought with the election of someone like a Barack Obama, a man of color, an African American, the son of, we'll say, former, well, not enslaved people in that case, but the representative of the people who had been enslaved, was a major breakthrough. But many of us have sensed this through analysis that said, hey, there's no such thing as a post-racial society in America. And we all can see this playing out before our very eyes. But let's take a look at what we're talking about. For example, and when it comes to the trauma of terrorism against our people, even with the emergence of the in the 1860s with the Emancipation Proclamation, one way in which this terrorism is directed against people of African descent is that it was documented that between the years following, at least the 50, 60, 80 years following the Emancipation Proclamation, more than 4,000 victims of lynching occurred throughout mostly a dozen southern states. I might add that maybe 95% of all lynchings in America involved people of African descent. We even found Italians and Jewish people who were also the victims of that terrorism. But one area of terrorism that many people are totally unfamiliar with, and the images from last week brought this to mind, is when we start to get whites who begin to think that they have the right, in many cases, to simply go into certain areas and do what they will. So last week we saw perhaps mostly men and some few women who thought as patriots, who thought that they understood that there had been some corruption in the American governmental system and there's too much governmental control and that everything that we read is false and that elections are not real and are rigged. They thought they had the privilege to do what they did. Now, in all honesty, I thought prior to that, without giving it too much thought, that if anybody ran up on the steps of the Capitol and acted like they were going to invade the building, that they probably would be shot on the spot, and the officer who shot would probably be highly justified. That was a part of our fears over the summer. There was a Black Lives Matter demonstrations all over the country, and particularly in Washington, D.C. Now I'm going to share with you something that many of you may not be familiar with. Because as the white population seizes their control and seizes their sense of privilege, this is the aftermath. Here you're looking at East St. Louis in the year 1921. This is the aftermath of control in black sections of town. The journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett, if you look at her works, discovered a very unique relationship between what was called, in many cases, you know, like lynchings and race riots, and their actual impact on the black community from the inside out, not the outside. In many cases, what appeared when a riot would, so-called riot would occur, Normally, the motivation might have been a statement such as, well, that nigger, he raped a white woman, or we think he raped a white woman. And that's all it would take for many cases to trigger this mob reaction. On one occasion, Ida B. Wells Barnett had gone away on a trip. When she returned home, a trip, she was away for a while from her home. When she returned, several of her male friends had been lynched. All right, so this sounds like something that occurs, except she noticed something that was more than a coincidence. Of the 3 or 4 men that she knew who had been lynched, all of them owned businesses in that particular town. And then she began to see and smell and sense the plot that was in hand, that in many cases, the acts of lynching and other forms of terrorism are not as random as they might appear from the outside, that they are pre-planned, very determinate, targets are selected, all of which are aimed at stopping the progress and the movement of the Negro population. That's why many African Americans, upon their emancipation, and once they understood the realities of living and not living and how vulnerable they were to lynching and other forms of destruction, began to move further west, in the Westlands, where prior U.S. policy had made millions of acres of land available to whites, but whites only. So many blacks decided not only to leave the South, but to seek areas where they could, in rural areas, set up whole communities with land, build their own homes, so that they would be nowhere near any white people. And that's what we would call the Black Town movement. We even had, many African Americans moving into Canada, which is not unlike what happened after the American Revolutionary War. The British made overtures toward the Negroes at the time, that if any of them took up arms against their masters, that they would be fighting the cause of the British. Sounds like a reasonable proposition, except that the British lost, as they did. Question may become, what would have happened to those Negroes after the Revolutionary War? Well, Britain was encouraged to then help those Negroes to move into Canada to escape the ravages of destruction here in this land. So that in Canada, we had these all black towns also beginning to emerge. But this is how the system of white power responded against any movement of the black populations. Here you can see the devastation afterwards. I believe well over 35 different blocks were destroyed.
Dr. Pritchett, I hate to interrupt, but you're not sharing your screen right now. Can you try and reshare?
Yeah, got it. I'm sorry. I may have slipped out of it.
You're okay, sir.
Let's see where it is. Hold on. Bear with me, everybody.
Take all the time you need, sir.
No. I hope I got it in before. Here we go. Are we good?
I can see it perfectly. Make sure you just launch the presentation, please.
All over again.
Perfect.
Thank you. We're good now. Okay. So here's the book by Jim Wallace. Here's my reminder about post-emancipation period, 4,000 people being lynched between 1863, moving into the 20th century, 1900s. And this is what East St. Louis looked like in 1921. And this is the aftermath. Here you see a car leaving the area, and they're not welcoming committee, but they're bye-bye committee. just another way of public demonstration of that act of terrorism. In 1936. This is a national parade of the Klan in Washington, D.C. I might mention one other area that some of you may or may not have heard of before, but in terms of an act of terrorism, but it was called the Black Wall Street Massacre, where once again Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this emerged in the news probably when Donald Trump was attempting to do a program in Tulsa on the day that was set up as Juneteenth Day. But once again, Tulsa, Oklahoma, at into the turn of the 20th century, where they had discovered oil, had Booker T. Washington gave it the nickname the Black Wall Street of America. There were more millionaires in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma than anywhere else in the country. And there was a rumor that a white woman had been startled as she was on an elevator ride with a Negro. And that's all it took to spark a revolt, which led to blocks, I think over 35 blocks being decimated in Black Wall Street in the Greenwood section. The people who survived that were so traumatized also that years and decades later, they couldn't bring themselves, like my mother or grandmother, to even talk about it. It's really only been in the last 15 years that the descendants, almost of the descendants, and some of the eldest people have been coddled and nurtured into the point where they can begin to share. And why is their trauma so great? Because they believe in their hearts, based upon the way life was decades ago, that if they were to begin to talk about these things, white men would come back and terrorize their communities once again. So this whole notion of terrorism is not, it's a very familiar subject to most Black folks. And I could say we've been hollering and screaming and teaching about it and doing presentations. And I guess many of us would be called Black radical activists as a ways of just simply labeling us stereotypically so that people can close their ears and their hearts. And now you can see, just as Malcolm X would have said in the 1960s, in 1963 when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm coined a phrase when he was asked by a reporter to comment on the assassination of Kennedy. And Malcolm said, "It looks like the chickens have come home to roost." Is the way a lot of ancestors would have talked, in that folklore way. That the chickens, the violence which America had created throughout its many centuries of existence, had come back upon them. And I would say America, after what we witnessed last week, we should all be on high alert. It's not over until it's over. And I don't think it's anywhere near over. We all have to band ourselves together. Dr. King would have said in his day, we should become the beloved community. Well, not that should we just love on each other, but we need to be proactive and dismantle the elements of racism and classism, sexism, and anti-religionism in this country. I want to thank you for your attention. And if anyone has any questions, I can entertain a question or two before we move into our final segment for today. Take a look at the chat box, maybe. If not, okay. I'm going to move into our final segment, which will deal with anti-racism notions. So, Burke, I'm going to need your just assistance for a minute, just to make sure I'm handling my responsibility and my clicks correctly.
Absolutely, sir.
From one angle, this is almost like being in a blind world, but we'll get it. We'll get it.
You're doing fine.
Is there anything on my screen yet?
Not yet, sir.
Okay, to make sure I'm in the sharing mode.
Hmm?
Are we getting there?
Yes, sir. There you go. Just launch that and you'll be good to go.
Yep. Go down to bear with me, something is blocking my. I'm getting a little, doesn't matter. There we go. Try that again. Okay, our brief presentation is at least one of the practical things I would hope that could come out of today, in addition to any of the gems you may have picked up from any of the other presentations. One of America's oldest problems, beyond the genocide of many of its inhabitants, is the attitude of racism. And I don't think this can be dealt with overnight. Take systematic approach. Burke, is my screen still active?
It is. There you go. It looks like a video that'll loop a bit.
Got it. I'm not too sure what happened, but anyway, once upon a time I thought that we could probably I thought there may be some advantage if in Washington they were pass a law that banned racism. But after I did some comparative study of how other countries pass similar laws, I realized that you can always pass a law, but that law does not guarantee that we can change people's hearts. So accept my humble presentation as my attempt to pierce the darkness. Each of us should take a look at the block called the continuum. And I asked the question, basically, in order for us to make any progress, each of us must determine where you are on this continuum, ranging from left to right. Would you be in the apathetic box? I remember over the last couple of years, when we've had a number of demonstrations and movements impacting the Seton Hall campus. And I can remember one of the other students at the university, many students, who wrote a response that said, if you don't like it here, why don't you transfer? Which obviously is within, her purview of understanding. But on the other hand, did she attempt to even understand what it was about, or did she simply close her eyes and her mind because of the skin color of those who were participating? I wonder if there were students on wheelchairs who were blocking the entrance to one of the main buildings on campus and indicating they had demands. I wonder how that same student might have responded to that group of students. After all, they're students just like she was. But how do we touch the heart of people? Not through laws, but through empathy. And moving into the second stage, I hope today that many of these professors have laid some understanding on each of us and laid some concepts in each of their fields that would help us to all become more active if this touches your soul today. and active to the point where you could become an advocate also. You and I and others, that we can join forces together to make not only Seton Hall a great place, a place that people would aspire to come to, because indeed we're not afraid to handle controversial issues, and that we are producing servant leaders who know not only how to provide service to others through volunteering, but can help to all of us as mankind to grow to a higher place in life. Many scholars think that we all are influenced by, and we have certain levels of bias within each of us. So here is a convenient chart that lets us know, as I have said on my comments there, that even a little bit of bias on a personal level, bias, not limited to racial bias or cultural bias. I mean, there are some people out there who might prefer strawberry ice cream over vanilla, and then others who would never, who only want chocolate. Bias not limited to matters of race, but on the other hand, race becomes the issue that none of us, the majority of us, find ourselves never ever bringing ourselves to the point of discussing it. So the attitude can then lead to acts, perhaps. If you don't know how the interposition between your values, your attitudes, and your behavioral dispositions. And then once it's tolerated on certain levels, it means then that other people in control who make laws and have the power to influence groups of people. That's where we can then see how these behaviors can then be manifested as systemic discrimination. And discrimination in a word means blocking the progress and the movement of other people. So when one group or a group has the power to determine that. But then when the people get tired of being discriminated against, and they start to raise their voices and start to collectivize themselves to take action, how does the system respond? Is it with listening and understanding and appreciation and helping those who had been formerly oppressed to move to their rightful places? Or does the system begin to respond with violence? If the system can get away with that form of organized violence, then we are only a short measure away from having legitimate, legalized, removal, systemic genocide against those people. You know, Dr. King once said, another quote, everything Hitler did was legal, just because they passed laws. What a lot of people don't realize, unless you study the emergence of the National Socialist Party in Germany after World War I, how did it become legal? Well, you think they passed the laws, but before they passed it, did they have any reference points? Yes. The National Socialist government found out that there were other countries and cultures that were practicing and doing some of the exact same things that they wanted to do. So their government began to import and request documents from these other countries about how they had done it. And do you know, in that context, documents were requested from the state of California on how they handled people who were being born, who were not exactly normal functioning at the IQ level, along with feeble-mindedness in terms of the range in which psychologists would measure mental functioning. California began to sterilize and pass laws that saying people with those lower levels of mental functioning couldn't marry each other. So yes, indeed, United States policies and concepts worked their way into ultimately what would become, what everybody would probably agree upon, a very horrific situation in Eastern Europe. There are seeds of American racism in that scenario. We then move to the zones of movement. I have to ask the question, how well do you actually know yourself? Are you more influenced by external circumstances? Or do you spend time working on your interior self? Are you living in fear of anyone or anything at this present moment? Do you think all immigrants are worthy of not coming into this country? Do you believe everything said to you by other people, even if it's very, very negative about other groups and other people? When your friends begin to say things that you don't feel very easy about, do you ever speak back to them to retort the things they've said to you? How can Seton Hall, how can your faculty mentors, how can you, as faculty or as students, members of a community, how can we help each other get into the learning zone? Maybe you can do it all by yourself, but can any of us come alongside and be allies? I certainly am no master on how white people develop their psychology, but I'd like to learn more. Would you like to learn more about the African American experience? I've tried to share at least one little piece of this that I thought over the last 30 minutes or so was perhaps very unknown to a lot of people, but known by many of us because it has personally impacted our lives. How often do you make time to sit and listen to others who are totally different than you? Or do you think you have no need to because you know all you need to know? Because all you want to do is get your degree and lead a comfortable life. And you don't want anything interfering with your zone of comfort. Well, where does that fall in these various zones? Think about it. I'll be available after this, God willing, throughout the remainder of this semester to every committee that I work with and other groups to begin to get us all in, if not just a learning zone, but into the zone of growth, but to help to move and ease people out of their zone of fear. And we hope that we're looking at, within the next 48 hours, the zone of fear collapsing in America. Let me thank all of my colleagues for joining us today. And let me thank our planning committee. We have been involved for the past year. Dr. Shoemaker on behalf of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Bizzarro on behalf of the Continuing Education and Professional Studies. And we thank Diane for your help. We thank our tech team, because believe me, many of us have great ideas, but when it comes to the control of the technical sphere and talking and managing the programming format, we are so appreciative of those the contributions that our entire team made this year. And we look for growth. We look for growth, so that I will look for, if anybody wants to send us emails later, just making any suggestions for building upon this platform. In one sense, I could say we don't really need to wait until next year for the next symposium. That is to say, the work is underway. We have a new strategic mission, which our provost shared this morning, and which will be momentarily will be shared with the entire university. It means we already have our sleeves already rolled up, but we all will be rolling them up a little bit higher as we begin to tackle those responsibilities. There are a couple of questions in. I'm reading while I'm also trying to talk, but I'm going to. Well, I think that's a question for Dr. Harris, and I think someone's going to be taking care of that. I'm just going to monitor any quick questions that may have been. I think, oh, we're good. Okay. So we look for commentary, we look for feedback, we look for progress, and I'll be communicating with all the students who have registered for the 1 credit with the MLK Day Symposium. We'll begin our dialogues over the next couple of days, and we look forward to seeing all the notes, as we might say, the copious notes that you may have generated from today. So if you have any questions, just please let me know. So let me also take a moment to let everybody know that 1 hour from now, we will be beginning our 3rd component for today in conjunction with the towns of South Orange and Maplewood and the Community Coalition on Race. We will be starting the Luminary program, but what we're doing this year is going to be slightly different than prior years. So if you wonder what we have done in prior years, I'll just mention it briefly, because perhaps 1 year from now, we'll be in a position to replicate what we've done over the last couple of years. Well, what we would normally do when this program is over, we all would walk over to the University Center, where we would have Luminary bags available and electronic candles, as well as hot chocolate and pretzels, compliments of the Division of Student Services. And we could have our families there, and of all ages, putting messages of peace on the luminaries. And then we would normally take them out to the University Seal and place them there as our tribute for the day, and we would ask for reflections. So this year, given the health restrictions, we have put together a virtual video presentation that we hope is complementary to what the town of South Orange is attempting to facilitate. I might also mention briefly, as I work along with the Community Coalition on Race, we are in the midst of planning an annual event called the Community Conversation on Race. It normally takes place in April. So I would call that to everyone's attention. Just look for the announcements as well. We just started the planning process, and we always look forward to having a great event that is making a contribution that helps to move people once again through the various zones. So on behalf of our technical team, on behalf of our planning team, on behalf of the entire university, we thank everyone from the president, the provost, all of the deans, all of the faculty, all of the students, all of the community, all of the alumni, all of the parents. We even extended an invitation this year through the Office of Enrollment Services to all high school seniors who were applying to the university this year. And we also made it clear that indeed their families could even join them if that was their desire. I want to thank my colleagues for their labor of love today in sharing to the best of their abilities their concise thoughts on this pathway to liberation. So thank you all, and may God bless us all through this period of sheltering in. A change is going to come, and we look forward to brighter and better tomorrows. Thank you, and good afternoon.